Beneath the ruins of the old world lie sealed chambers that promised salvation, but delivered something far more troubling. Each vault door concealing choices made in boardrooms before the bombs ever fell. Decisions that would echo through centuries of sealed corridors and failing life support systems. Before you drift off, maybe tap subscribe for more gentle videos, and let me know where you're listening from tonight. Drifting softly into the first hidden truth about Vault 13, where isolation became the only experiment that mattered, and time itself grew heavy behind reinforced steel. Vault 13 was never meant to open when it did. The water chip failure that sent the vault dweller into the wasteland interrupted an experiment designed to last 200 years, studying how complete isolation from the outside world would reshape a community across generations. The overseer knew this truth, carrying the weight of sealed orders that outlined Vault Tech's true intentions for the people who called those tunnels home. Every day that passed represented data points in a study about human adaptation to permanent separation from the surface, measuring how traditions would evolve and how memory of the old world would fade into mythology. The residents developed their own culture during those decades underground. They celebrated holidays that no longer had meaning on the irradiated surface, passing down stories about sunshine and rain to children who had never felt either on their skin. The vault's library became a sacred space where volunteers maintained pre-war knowledge, though with each generation, the words on those pages felt more like fantasy than history. Social structures solidified around roles that had no context outside those walls, creating hierarchies based on maintaining systems that existed only because the vault existed. When the vault dweller returned from the wasteland, bringing not just a replacement water chip, but also knowledge of what lay beyond, the overseer faced an impossible choice. The experiment required continued isolation, but the vault now knew that survival was possible outside. The decision to exile the hero became the overseer's final act of preserving Vault Tech's design, protecting the experiment even as it crumbled. That exile revealed how deeply the vault's purpose had corrupted what should have been simple gratitude, choosing data over humanity. The descendants of Vault 13 would eventually emerge anyway, spreading into the wasteland and carrying with them the psychological scars of generations spent believing the world had ended completely. Their interactions with other survivors revealed how isolation had shaped their worldview, making trust difficult and change frightening. The experiment succeeded in documenting exactly how a sealed community evolves, but at the cost of creating people who would struggle to adapt when their controlled environment finally opened. Vault Tech's notes probably cataloged this outcome with clinical satisfaction, another data point in their grand study of human behavior under controlled stress. Vault 15 took a different approach to studying social dynamics. Instead of isolation, Vault Tech filled this facility with people from radically different backgrounds, ideologies, and cultural traditions, then sealed them together to observe what would happen. The experiment aimed to determine whether diversity would strengthen a community through varied perspectives or fracture it through incompatible worldviews. The designers provided just enough resources to survive, but not enough to thrive comfortably, ensuring that competition for supplies would test whatever social bonds formed. The vault descended into conflict within the first few years. Different groups claimed different sections of the facility, establishing territories based on shared beliefs and backgrounds. What Vault Tech called social experimentation, the residents experienced as daily tension that occasionally erupted into violence. The overseer's logs documented how quickly people retreated into familiar groups when stressed, how shared language and customs became weapons of exclusion, how scarcity transformed philosophical differences into survival imperatives. Eventually, the vault fractured completely. Groups left at different times, carrying their vault-forged identities into the wasteland, where they evolved into distinct factions. Some became raider gangs, using the survival skills learned underground to prey on weaker settlements. Others attempted to build something better, drawing on the cooperative lessons learned from Vault Life's failures. The most successful group eventually founded the New California Republic, transforming their Vault experience into a vision of democratic governance that would reshape the entire region. The irony of Vault 15's legacy lies in how both its failures and successes validated Vault-Tech's hypothesis. The experiment proved that diversity under pressure creates both conflict and innovation, that shared hardship can either unite or divide depending on leadership and resources. The scattered descendants of this single vault became raiders, merchants, soldiers, and senators, their divergent paths all rooted in the same underground starting point. Vault-Tech's clinical observations about human nature became the foundation for some of the wasteland's most important political movements. The long-term impact of this experiment extended far beyond Vault-Tech's original scope. The NCR's founding principles directly opposed the authoritarian structure that had governed Vault 15, suggesting that the residents learned more from what they rejected than what they accepted. Their insistence on democratic representation and individual rights came from experiencing the opposite underground, where the overseer's word was absolute and dissent meant exile or worse. The Vault's diversity experiment inadvertently created the ideological foundation for the Wasteland's most prominent republic. Vault 12 represents one of Vault-Tech's most deliberately cruel experiments. The vault door was engineered to malfunction, designed to fail in sealing completely, so that radiation would gradually seep into the facility over decades. The residents were told nothing about this flaw, believing themselves safe behind what they thought was functioning protection. Vault-Tech wanted to study the long-term effects of gradual radiation exposure on a controlled population, documenting the physical and psychological changes as the inhabitants slowly transformed. The ghoulification process began subtly. Residents noticed increased fatigue, skin irritation, hair loss, and other symptoms they attributed to vault life stress rather than radiation exposure. The medical staff noted these changes in their logs, following protocols that required detailed documentation without intervention. Some doctors suspected the truth, but faced an impossible ethical dilemma between their healing oaths and their employment contracts that forbade interfering with vault operations. As the transformation accelerated, panic spread through the community. Families watched loved ones change, their skin growing rough and discolored, their voices becoming raspy, their bodies requiring less food and water, but seeming increasingly different from what humans were supposed to be. The social fabric tore as some residents blamed others for imagined contaminations, while the medical staff struggled to explain what was happening without admitting they had always known the door was compromised. The vault that emerged into history became Necropolis, a city of ghouls who had lost their human appearance, but retained their humanity and memories. These survivors formed their own society, adapting to their new existence, while grappling with the knowledge that they had been deliberately transformed. Their experience with gradual change, rather than sudden mutation, gave them unique perspectives on identity and survival, shaping a culture that would influence ghoul communities across the wasteland. The psychological impact of learning the truth about their transformation haunted Necropolis for generations. The residents had to reconcile their memories of trusting Vault-Tech's promises with the reality of having been test subjects in an experiment that destroyed their bodies while preserving their minds. Some found purpose in survival, others in revenge, but all carried the weight of betrayal that went beyond simple deception into something more profound. Vault 8 functioned almost exactly as advertised, making it an anomaly among Vault-Tech facilities. This control vault opened on schedule, 10 years after the bombs fell, releasing its residents with a Garden of Eden creation kit to rebuild civilization. The inhabitants established Vault City, creating one of the wasteland's most technologically advanced and stable communities. Their success demonstrated what vaults could have been if Vault Tech had prioritized human welfare over experimental data. The residents of Vault 8 carried into the wasteland a sense of superiority rooted in their vault experience. They had been selected for the vault based on genetic health, education, and social standing, creating a pre-war elite who survived the apocalypse with their privilege intact. This foundation shaped Vault City's culture, where citizenship was restricted and outsiders were viewed as genetically and culturally inferior. The Vault's success in preserving civilization came with a dark undercurrent of discrimination. The city's dependence on slave labor revealed how even functional vaults could produce morally compromised societies. The residents justified their practices by pointing to their superior technology and organization, arguing that their way of life represented humanity's best chance for recovery. They failed to recognize how their vault-born insularity had created blind spots about the value of people who had survived outside, whose hardships had taught different but equally valid lessons about resilience and adaptation. Vault City's interactions with other wasteland factions demonstrated the limitations of technological superiority without ethical foundation. Their advanced medical facilities and clean water couldn't compensate for their rigid social structure and contempt for outsiders. Neighboring communities sometimes traded with Vault City, but rarely trusted it, recognizing that the citizens' vault heritage had instilled values incompatible with cooperative survival in the New World. The long-term legacy of Vault 8 proved that successful preservation of pre-war technology and knowledge meant nothing without preserving pre-war ideals of equality and human dignity. The Vault's residents had maintained their society's technical capabilities while abandoning its moral foundations, creating a cautionary tale about how isolation can preserve some aspects of culture while poisoning others. Vault Tech's Control Vault succeeded in its stated mission while revealing how success could still breed its own problems. Vault 11 housed one of the most psychologically devastating experiments ever conceived. The social structure required residents to sacrifice one person each year by democratic vote, sending them to the overseer's office where automated systems would execute them. The Vault's residents believed this annual sacrifice was necessary for their survival, that failure to comply would result in the entire Vault's destruction. This belief drove the community for decades, forcing them to participate in ritualized murder while maintaining the appearance of democratic process. The voting became increasingly corrupt as factions formed around protecting their own members. Political alliances shifted based on who could be convinced to vote for whom, transforming the Vault into a perpetual campaign where the stakes were literal life and death. Families made deals, traded favors, and betrayed neighbors to ensure their loved ones wouldn't be chosen. The annual ritual poisoned every relationship, making genuine trust impossible when everyone knew that survival might require voting for someone else's death. The psychological toll manifested in elaborate justifications. Residents convinced themselves that the sacrificed individuals were somehow less valuable, creating moral frameworks to rationalize participating in murder. They held ceremonies that honored the sacrifice while simultaneously working to ensure they would never be the ones chosen. The cognitive dissonance required to maintain this society created deep psychological scars passed down to children who grew up knowing they might someday face selection. The truth emerged only when the Vault population had dwindled to 5 individuals. After the final sacrifice, the Vault's automated systems revealed that the annual executions had never been necessary, that refusing to participate at any point would have ended the experiment and with everyone's survival guaranteed. The voice recording congratulated the survivors for their choice to stop participating, a cruel joke that came far too late for the hundreds who had died in the preceding decades. The four survivors who learned this truth faced an impossible psychological burden. They had participated in a system that murdered their friends and family for no reason, voting in elections that served only to satisfy Vault Tech's curiosity about how far people would go to survive. The revelation destroyed whatever remained of their sanity, sending them into the wasteland carrying guilt that no amount of time could diminish. Their story became a warning about the dangers of accepting authority without question, about how democratic processes can be corrupted when operating under false premises. Vault 27 was designed to be deliberately overcrowded, packing roughly 4 times the standard population into its standard-sized facility. Vault Tech wanted to study how extreme population density would affect social behavior, resource management, and psychological stability. The experiment began the moment the doors sealed, with residents immediately facing insufficient sleeping quarters, inadequate bathroom facilities, and lines for everything from food distribution to medical care. The physical discomfort was intentional and relentless. Personal space became a luxury that only the most aggressive or politically connected could maintain. Families were separated because there wasn't enough room for them to stay together. Children grew up in communal sleeping areas with hundreds of others, and privacy became a concept that existed only in memory. The constant proximity to others created sensory overload, where the sounds and smells of too many people in too small a space became the permanent background of existence. Social structures collapsed under the pressure. Traditional family units couldn't function when members were scattered across different sections of the vault, working different shifts and eating at different times. The overseer's attempts to maintain order through strict scheduling only highlighted how insufficient the resources were, creating resentment toward authority that couldn't solve the fundamental problem. Violence erupted regularly as stressed residents lashed out at anyone nearby, their targets often arbitrary victims of accumulated frustration. The vault's infrastructure failed under the strain. Water recycling systems, as designed for standard populations, couldn't handle the increased demand, leading to rationing that left people perpetually thirsty. Air filtration struggled to keep pace with the carbon dioxide production of so many people in enclosed spaces, creating a stuffy atmosphere that made breathing feel labored. The generators ran constantly at maximum capacity, their maintenance becoming a critical concern as replacement parts dwindled and expertise was spread too thin. The population began to decline as the stress took its toll. Disease spread rapidly through the overcrowded facility, overwhelming the medical staff and limited supplies. Birth rates dropped as exhausted residents had neither the privacy nor the energy for maintaining relationships. The psychological pressure drove some residents to suicide, while others simply gave up, their bodies shutting down from the constant activation of stress responses. Within 50 years, the vault population had decreased to more manageable numbers, but the survivors carried permanent trauma from decades of involuntary closeness and competition for basic necessities. Vault 34 became a disaster through a different kind of oversight. The armory was deliberately overstocked with weapons and ammunition, while the entertainment and recreational facilities received minimal resources. Vault-Tec wanted to observe how a heavily armed population with insufficient outlets for aggression and stress would develop socially. The experiment assumed that access to weapons would create either an armed peace through mutual deterrence or descend into violence, both outcomes providing valuable data about human nature under pressure. The Vault's culture quickly became centered around firearms. Gun maintenance, marksmanship practice, and weapons knowledge became primary social activities, filling the void left by inadequate recreation options. Children learned to handle weapons so before they could read, and proficiency with firearms became a mark of status and maturity. The armory's abundance meant that nearly every adult possessed multiple weapons, creating a society where armed conflict was always just one argument away. The reactor's radiation leak transformed this powder keg into catastrophe. As background radiation levels slowly increased, the residents' judgment became impaired while their access to weapons remained unchanged. Paranoia grew alongside radiation exposure, with people seeing threats in ordinary interactions and responding with disproportionate force. The vault descended into armed chaos as irradiated residents, their minds deteriorating from radiation exposure, turned on each other with the very weapons that had defined their culture. The survivors who eventually left the vault became the Boomers, a faction whose entire identity centered on their exceptional weapon skills and explosive expertise. They carried with them the vault's obsession with firepower while adding a layer of extreme xenophobia born from their traumatic exodus. Their settlement at Nellis Air Force Base represented both the culmination of Vault 34's weapons culture and an attempt to recreate the security they had lost when the vault became uninhabitable. The Boomers' relationship with the wasteland reflected their vault origins in fascinating ways. They possessed incredible technical knowledge about weapons and explosives, as skills that made them formidable, but also isolated them from communities that couldn't match their firepower. Their extreme distrust of outsiders came from both their vault's failure and the necessity of fighting their way through the wasteland to reach Nellis. The vault's experiment in creating an armed society succeeded in producing weapons experts, but failed to create people capable of peaceful coexistence with others. Vault 77 contained perhaps the most psychologically cruel experiment in Vault Tech's entire portfolio. One man was sealed into the vault along with a crate of puppets, creating a situation of absolute isolation where the only potential companions were inanimate objects. Vault Tech wanted to study the effects of complete loneliness on the human psyche, documenting how someone would adapt when their only option for social interaction was projecting personalities onto cloth and wood. The descent into madness was gradual but inevitable. The lone inhabitant began by treating the puppets as simple entertainment, creating shows and scenarios to pass the time. As months became years, the puppets evolved into distinct characters with their own personalities, preferences, and relationships. The man started consulting them for decisions, having arguments with them, forming alliances and enemies within his puppet society. His mind created an entire social world from nothing, populating his isolation with imaginary beings that felt increasingly real. The puppet society developed its own complex politics. The man documented elections, betrayals, romances, and feuds among the puppets, his logs revealing a slide into complete detachment from reality. He held trials for puppets accused of crimes, executed some and buried others with full ceremonies, and eventually staged a puppet revolution that he described as traumatic and violent. The line between performance and belief dissolved completely as his isolation transformed psychological coping mechanism into genuine delusion. The breaking point came when he murdered the king puppet in what his notes called a justified coup. He escaped the vault wearing a crown made from puppet heads, emerging into the wasteland as the self-proclaimed ruler of a puppet kingdom. The character known as the Puppet Man became a wasteland legend, a figure whose story was too bizarre to fully believe, but too specific to dismiss as fiction. Some claim his vault jumpsuit was later found in Paradise Falls, suggesting he survived long enough to become a slaver, though whether he distinguished between human and puppet slaves remains unclear. The Puppet Man's story demonstrates how the human need for social connection will create society from anything available, even when that means descending into delusion. His elaborate puppet world wasn't madness in the traditional sense, but rather an adaptation to circumstances that human psychology wasn't designed to handle. Vault-Tech's experiment proved that isolation doesn't just affect mood or behavior, but can fundamentally alter perception of reality itself, creating entire worlds inside a single deteriorating mind. Vault 106 was designated as a control vault, but included a subtle modification that would prove catastrophic. The entrance was deliberately difficult to access, positioned on a steep cliff face with unstable approaches that made leaving or entering exceptionally dangerous. This design wasn't mentioned in any official Vault documentation, appearing only in classified Vault Tech files as a study in how physical isolation would affect a community that had the option to leave but faced significant barriers to doing so. The first few years proceeded normally as residents adjusted to Vault life without immediate need to venture outside. The cliff face meant nothing when they believed the surface was a radiated wasteland, unsuitable for human survival. However, as time passed and conditions in the vault deteriorated slightly through normal wear on systems, the question of whether to risk the dangerous exit began dividing the community into factions with radically different risk assessments. Some residents argued that the vault systems would eventually fail completely, making the dangerous exit necessary for survival, regardless of current conditions. Others pointed out that attempting the cliff exit had already killed 3 people in preliminary scouting attempts, making the known danger of leaving seem worse than the theoretical danger of staying. The debate consumed the Vault's political discourse, creating division between those who trusted in Vault-Tech's engineering and those who wanted to take control of their own destiny. The overseer faced pressure from both sides, but lacked clear guidance from Vault-Tech about which choice served the experiment's purposes better. The classified nature of the entrance design meant that even Vault leadership didn't know whether staying or leaving was the intended outcome Vault-Tech wanted to study. This uncertainty paralyzed decision-making, as every choice felt like potentially walking into a trap designed by engineers who had anticipated this exact dilemma. Eventually, a group of residents attempted the exit during a night when the overseer's attention was focused on a medical emergency. The attempt resulted in multiple deaths as the unstable cliff face gave way, sending climbers and rock tumbling into the darkness below. The survivors who reached the surface found themselves in a wasteland that was harsh but survivable, validating the risk takers while simultaneously confirming the danger avoiders' concerns about the exit's hazards. The Vault never reached consensus, forever divided by the question of whether the experiment had been about the cliff or about the choice itself. Vault 68 and 69 represented Vault-Tech's most socially controversial experiments, designed to study gender dynamics under extreme imbalance. Vault 68 contained 999 men and 1 woman, while Vault 69 reversed the ratio with 999 women and 1 man. The experiments aimed to document how extreme gender imbalances would affect social structure, power dynamics, reproduction, and long-term community stability across generations. Both vaults faced immediate psychological pressure that intensified as the populations recognized their situations. The single individuals of minority gender experienced isolation, despite being surrounded by people, their unique position making them simultaneously the focus of attention and fundamentally alone in their experience. The majority populations struggled with competition, jealousy, and the question of how to structure a society around such profound imbalance. Vault-Tech's files on these experiments remain heavily redacted, with most documentation sealed under classification levels that suggest the outcomes were considered too sensitive for public knowledge. The few surviving records hint at complex social structures that developed, involving communal parenting arrangements, political systems based partly on reproductive access, and psychological adaptations that challenged pre-war assumptions about gender and society. The long-term implications troubled even Vault-Tech's most detached researchers. Both vaults would face genetic bottleneck problems within a few generations, as limited genetic diversity from one parent would create health issues that no amount of social adaptation could overcome. The experiments seemed designed to document social collapse rather than long term survival, suggesting Vault Tech's interest lay more in observing crisis than in understanding sustainable communities. The ethical questions raised by these vaults extended beyond the obvious issues of reproductive coercion and social pressure. The experiments deliberately created situations where individual autonomy and community survival came into direct conflict, where personal choice became a luxury that could threaten the group's future. Vault-Tech's clinical observation of these dynamics revealed the company's fundamental view of human beings as experimental subjects whose suffering could be justified by the data it produced. Vault 92 housed an experiment in subliminal messaging and behavioral control through audio manipulation. The Vault's public address system was modified to broadcast white noise patterns at frequencies below conscious awareness, with embedded suggestions designed to increase aggression and anxiety. Vault-Tech wanted to study whether subliminal conditioning could create a military force from civilian populations, turning ordinary vault dwellers into soldiers through sustained psychological manipulation. The effects manifested gradually over years of exposure. Residents reported increasing difficulty sleeping, describing dreams filled with violence and paranoid scenarios. Interpersonal conflicts escalated more quickly than in previous generations, with residents noting that disagreements seemed to bypass normal de-escalation and jump straight to confrontation. The Vault's security force found themselves breaking up fights with increasing frequency, puzzled by the growing aggression among people who had previously coexisted peacefully. The overseer, who was partially shielded from the subliminal broadcasts through soundproofed quarters, documented the changes with growing concern. Vault residents began organizing into militaristic units without any external threat to justify the structure, creating rank systems and conducting combat drills in the Vault's common areas. Children exposed to the broadcasts from birth displayed higher baseline aggression than their parents, suggesting the effects intensified with sustained exposure over developmental periods. The experiment succeeded in creating a vault full of psychologically conditioned soldiers, but failed to control them effectively. Without a designated enemy to focus their aggression toward, the residents turned on each other and eventually on the vault's leadership structure. The white noise conditioning had made them aggressive, but not obedient, creating a population of people primed for violence without the discipline or structure to channel it productively. The survivors who eventually left the vault carried their conditioning into the wasteland, where their combat-ready mindset proved advantageous for survival but problematic for building communities. They struggled with peaceful interaction, their years of subliminal conditioning having rewired their default responses toward conflict rather than cooperation. Some became successful mercenaries. Their vault created aggression, finding purpose in the wasteland's violence, while others simply wandered, unable to find a place where their conditioning matched their environment. Vault 108 contained one of the most disturbing experiments in Vault-Tech's catalog. The Vault's cloning facilities were programmed with an error in the genetic template, causing all clones to be produced from a single individual named Gary. Over time, the Vault became populated entirely by genetically identical individuals who all shared the same name, appearance, and baseline personality, creating a society of doppelgangers that descended into violent chaos. The original Gary, the Vault's only non-clone resident, documented the early stages with clinical detachment that gradually gave way to horror. The first few clones seemed normal enough, displaying individual personalities despite their genetic identity. However, as more clones emerged and the original human population died off, the Garys began developing a hive mind-like mentality that expressed itself through violence and bizarre behavior. The The clones communicated almost entirely through variations of their shared name, using tone and inflection to convey complex meanings in a language only other Garys understood. They organized into groups that would attack each other without apparent provocation, their violence thus lacking any clear purpose beyond the act itself. The Vault descended into perpetual warfare between identical factions, with dead Garys littering the corridors, while new Garys emerged from the cloning facilities to join the endless conflict. The psychological implications troubled the original Gary enough that his final logs speculated whether the clones possessed individual consciousness or operated as extensions of some shared awareness. He noted that killing one Gary seemed to affect the behavior of nearby Garys in ways that suggested connection beyond normal human social bonding. His final entry documented his decision to seal himself in a secure section of the vault, though whether he died there or eventually left remains unknown. The surviving Garys continued their violent existence long after the original vault experiment had concluded, creating a persistent danger for anyone who entered the facility. Their behavior suggested that the cloning error had created something fundamentally broken in their psychological makeup, though whether this was genetic degradation, accumulated trauma from living among identical copies, or something stranger remains unclear. The Vault stood as a monument to the dangers of cloning technology implemented without adequate safeguards or ethical oversight. Vault 111 served as the setting for Fallout 4's opening, a cryogenic preservation facility marketed as a premium survival solution for wealthy pre-war citizens. The residents believed they would sleep through the apocalypse and wake to a better world, unaware that Vault-Tech's true experiment involved observing the psychological effects of indefinite cryogenic suspension and selective awakening. The Institute's later intrusion to steal an infant and murder a parent added layers of tragedy that Vault-Tech's original designers never anticipated. The cryogenic pods were designed with periodic, brief awakenings, moments of consciousness that would allow researchers to monitor the subject's psychological state without fully reviving them. These partial awakenings created nightmarish scenarios where frozen residents experienced brief flashes of awareness, seeing their still frozen family members in the passage of time without ability to act or escape. The cumulative psychological impact of these moments across 2 centuries created trauma that mere survival couldn't erase. The Vault staff weren't included in the cryogenic preservation, a detail that sparked a rebellion when they realized Vault-Tech had designated them as expendable. Their skeletons throughout the facility told a story of violence between employees who had expected to survive and those who had known they were always meant to die. The rebellion's failure meant the frozen residents remained in their pods without any staff to monitor or maintain the systems, relying entirely on automation that gradually deteriorated over centuries. The Institute's decision to use Vault 111 as a source of uncontaminated genetic material represented a cruel irony. The residents had purchased premium Vault spots to ensure their survival, only to become breeding stock for an organization that viewed them as resources rather than people. The kidnapping of Sean and murder of his parent demonstrated how Vault dwellers remained vulnerable even in their supposed safety, their cryogenic sleep offering no protection against determined intrusion. The sole survivor's eventual awakening revealed a world that had moved on without them, where their pre-war skills and knowledge were simultaneously valuable and outdated. The Vault's experiment in cryogenic preservation succeeded in maintaining a human in perfect condition across centuries, but couldn't preserve the world they had known or protect them from the psychological cost of losing everything familiar. Vault-Tech's data on long-term cryogenic effects was purchased with the destruction of entire families who had trusted their promises of safety. Vault 112 trapped its residents in virtual reality simulation designed by Dr. Stanislaus Braun, a genius who used his position to satisfy his sadistic impulses. The Garden of Eden Creation Kit, or GEC technology, was repurposed to create Tranquility Lane, a simulation of pre-war suburban America where Braun could torture the same people indefinitely, killing them in the simulation and resurrecting them to kill again without any lasting consequences except psychological trauma. The residents existed in their pods for over 2 centuries, their minds experiencing what felt like endless variations of the same suburban scenario. Braun, operating in the simulation as a little girl named Betty, forced them through scenarios ranging from mundane social torture to outright violence, their memories periodically wiped when he grew bored of the current configuration. The simulation's victims had no idea they were virtual, experiencing each death and resurrection as real, their suffering serving no purpose except entertaining their captor. The technology demonstrated capabilities that Vault-Tec never publicly acknowledged, suggesting the guy's psyche was far more than a simple terraforming device. Braun's ability to trap conscious minds in virtual reality indefinitely pointed to advances in neural interface technology that could revolutionize or enslave humanity depending on who controlled it. His choice to use this power for torture rather than benefit revealed the danger of giving unchecked authority to brilliant but morally bankrupt individuals. The few visitors to Vault 112 faced impossible choices. Freeing the residents meant killing their bodies, as their minds had been connected to the simulation so long that disconnection would be fatal. Leaving them meant condemning them to continued torture under Braun's control. The moral calculus offered no good options, only choices between different types of harm, reflecting Vault-Tec's pattern of creating scenarios where all outcomes involved suffering. The existence of Tranquility Lane raised questions about other vaults and what capabilities Vault-Tec possessed, but chose not to deploy. If virtual reality prisons were possible, what other technologies existed in classified files, waiting to be discovered in sealed vaults across the wasteland? Braun's simulation represented both the pinnacle of pre-war technology and its most horrifying application, a reminder that human creativity could serve either liberation or enslavement. Vault 114 demonstrated Vault-Tec's interest in noise pollution's effects on human psychology and behavior. The Vault's public address system was programmed to emit random noises at irregular intervals, from loud industrial sounds to quiet, unsettling whispers, preventing residents from ever experiencing true silence or developing reliable auditory patterns. The experiment aimed to document how constant auditory stress would affect sleep, decision-making, social cohesion, and long-term mental health. The first weeks were merely annoying as residents adapted to unexpected sounds interrupting their activities. However, as months passed without any pattern or predictability, the psychological toll mounted. Sleep deprivation became universal, as residents could never know when a blaring alarm or grinding mechanical noise would wake them. Social interactions suffered as people couldn't hold conversations without frequent interruptions, leading to increased isolation as residents retreated to private spaces that offered no more quiet than public ones. The Vault's children, raised from birth with constant noise, developed differently from their parents. They adapted to the conditions by learning to tune out auditory information, but this adaptation came with developmental costs, as many struggled with language acquisition and social cueing that relied on subtle audio patterns, their brains having learned to filter out so much ambient sound that they missed important signals too. The second generation showed higher rates of hearing damage from the constant exposure to loud noises without adequate protection. Mental health deteriorated across the population as the unrelenting noise prevented the psychological rest that silence provides. Residents reported hallucinating sounds during the rare moments of quiet, their brains so conditioned to expect noise that absence felt wrong. Some developed elaborate rituals to cope, wearing makeshift ear protection despite it being against vault regulations, while others embraced the noise and started adding their own contributions, filling the vault with their screams and songs in an attempt to exert some control over their auditory environment. The experiment ultimately demonstrated that humans need acoustic privacy and predictability as much as they need food and water. The vault's population declined through suicide and stress related health problems, with survivors eventually disabling the noise system in an act of collective rebellion that Vault-Tec's designers had presumably anticipated and documented. The silence that followed felt profound to residents who had never experienced it, changing their behavior patterns as dramatically as the noise had initially disrupted them. Vault 81 housed an experiment in interrupted cryogenic storage, where residents were supposed to be frozen for only a short period, but were instead left in suspended animation for much longer due to deliberate system malfunctions. The experiment studied the psychological impact of time displacement, documenting how people would react to waking and discovering that far more time had passed than they expected. The vault's residents lost years, then decades, then centuries to sleep they hadn't consented to extend, emerging into a world that bore no resemblance to the one they remembered. The first awakenings after unplanned delays created confusion and anger as residents tried to understand why they had been left frozen beyond the agreed time frame. The vault's automated systems provided no answers, leaving the confused dwellers to conclude that some catastrophic failure had occurred rather than recognizing their extended sleep as intentional. Some chose to return to cryosleep, hoping future awakenings would provide better circumstances, while others attempted to maintain vault operations while waiting for answers that would never come. The psychological stress of repeated time jumps fragmented the vault's community. People who had been frozen together woke at different times, creating relationship disruptions as couples and families found themselves separated by decades or centuries of subjective time. Parents woke to find their children had aged into elderly strangers. Friendships dissolved across time gaps that made common experience impossible. The vault's social structure couldn't survive when its members existed in different temporal contexts. The final awakenings revealed a wasteland so changed that the vault's residents lacked any frame of reference for understanding it. They had missed the immediate post-war period, the formation of early wasteland societies, and the evolution of new cultures that had no connection to their pre-war world. Their cultural knowledge was obsolete, their skills often irrelevant, and their memories of the old world so distant that younger wasteland inhabitants viewed them as living fossils. The experiment's cruelty lay in how it robbed people of their lives without the release of death. The frozen residents lost centuries they could have spent adapting, surviving, or simply experiencing existence, instead skipping directly from the old world to a future they couldn't understand. Vault-Tec's data on time displacement came at the cost of destroying hundreds of lives, reducing people to data points in a study about adjustment to temporal trauma. Vault 95 demonstrated Vault-Tec's interest in addiction and psychological dependency. The vault operated normally for 5 years, allowing residents to establish routines and find comfort in their underground existence. Then, on a predetermined schedule, the vault's supply of cigarettes, alcohol, and certain medications was cut off completely, while comfort foods and entertainment options were simultaneously removed. The experiment aimed to document how a community would handle mass withdrawal and the loss of coping mechanisms during an already stressful existence. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. Residents who had used nicotine to manage stress found themselves unable to focus or relax, their addiction creating physical discomfort that made vault life intolerable. Those dependent on alcohol experienced withdrawal symptoms, that ranged from anxiety to life-threatening seizures, overwhelming the vault's medical facilities. The simultaneous loss of comfort foods and entertainment removed even simple pleasures, leaving residents with nothing to distract them from their confined existence. Social cohesion collapsed as withdrawal and stress made everyone irritable and hostile. The vault descended into violence as people fought over hoarded supplies, with some residents having hidden contraband before the official cutoff. The black market that emerged created new social hierarchies based on who could provide the banned substances, corrupting the vault's original power structures. Murder, as the theft, and assault became common as addiction and stress overrode social bonds. The overseer, watching from secure quarters, documented the breakdown while following orders not to intervene regardless of the death toll. The experiment's design assumed that eventually the residents would adapt to the absence of their dependencies, but Vault-Tech's timeline underestimated how thoroughly pre-war society had integrated chemical comfort into daily life. Most residents never adapted, instead spiraling deeper into depression and violence. The long-term survivors who emerged from Vault 95 carried profound distrust of authority and systems that could arbitrarily remove resources. Their experience taught them to never depend on single sources for anything essential, to maintain hidden reserves, and to view official promises with skepticism. The Vault's experiment in forced withdrawal succeeded in documenting the breakdown it caused, but failed to produce any useful data about recovery or adaptation, as most residents died before reaching that stage. Vault 106 housed an experiment with psychoactive drugs added to the air filtration system, creating an environment where residents unknowingly inhaled hallucinogenic compounds that Vault-Tech developed for military applications. The experiment studied how sustained low-level hallucinogen exposure would affect community function, decision-making, and long-term psychological stability. The residents experienced reality through a chemical filter they didn't know existed, making their entire vault experience a prolonged trip. The initial effects were subtle enough that residents didn't recognize them as hallucinations. Shadows seemed to move at the edge of vision, colors appeared more vivid, and emotional responses felt heightened without clear cause. People attributed these experiences to stress or vault life rather than external chemical influence. As the exposure continued, the effects intensified, creating shared delusions as multiple residents began seeing similar hallucinations and reinforcing each other's altered perceptions. The vault's culture evolved around the hallucinations, incorporating them into daily life as accepted aspects of their reality. Residents developed rituals to appease entities that didn't exist, created rules to avoid triggering phenomenon that were only chemical effects, and organized their society around navigating a world that was partly real and partly drug-induced illusion. Children raised in this environment knew no other baseline for reality. Their entire understanding of how the world worked, shaped by hallucinogenic perception. The psychological damage became permanent, even after the drugs were eventually discontinued. Residents who left the vault discovered that the outside world didn't match their expectations, as they had spent years adapting to rules that only applied in their chemically altered environment. Their perceptions remained unreliable even without continued exposure, their brains having rewired around the assumption that reality was fluid and subjective. Many couldn't function in normal environments, their vault conditioning having destroyed their ability to accurately process sensory information. The military applications Vault-Tech had hoped to study never materialized because the subjects became too unstable for reliable deployment. The experiment proved that sustained hallucinogen exposure created psychological damage that persisted long after the chemicals cleared, making the affected population unsuitable for any role requiring accurate reality assessment. The Vault's residents paid the price for data that ultimately showed the approach was too harmful to be practical even by Vault Tech's limited ethical standards. Vault 3 was designed as a control vault that would function normally without experimental modifications, representing what Vault Tech facilities could accomplish when used as advertised. The vault operated successfully for years, maintaining a stable community that adapted well to underground life. However, the story of Vault 3 became a cautionary tale, not about Vault Tech's experiments, but about the dangers of trusting outsiders in the post-apocalyptic wasteland. The vault's residents, having never experienced the wasteland's brutality firsthand, retained optimistic assumptions about human nature that their ancestors had carried from the pre-war world. When a group of travelers appeared at the vault door claiming to need help, the residents voted to allow them inside, believing that hospitality and mutual aid were still viable strategies for survival. This decision would prove fatal to nearly everyone who voted in favor. The travelers were actually members of the Fiends, a raider gang addicted to psychoactive chemicals that destroyed their empathy and impulse control. Once inside, the Fiends massacred the vault's population and claimed the facility as their base. The few survivors who escaped carried the guilt of the decision that had doomed their community, their trust having been weaponized against them by people who viewed compassion as weakness to exploit. The irony of Vault 3's fate lay in how a functional vault was destroyed not by Vault Tech's experiments, but by the very human qualities the experiments usually targeted. The residents' capacity for trust, cooperation, and optimism proved maladaptive in a world where those traits could get you killed. Their vault succeeded according to Vault Tech's control parameters, but failed at the more fundamental task of surviving contact with the wasteland's reality. The Fiend's occupation of Vault 3 demonstrated how easily pre-war infrastructure could be repurposed for purposes its designers never intended. The vault's security systems, meant to keep radiation out, kept victims in during the massacre, and later helped the Fiends defend their new territory against outside threats. The facility's comfortable living spaces became drug dens, its medical bay turned into a torture chamber, and its public areas transformed into the headquarters of one of the wasteland's most feared raider gangs. Vault 3's story showed that the greatest dangers in the post-war world weren't always the obvious threats, but the unexpected failures of judgment made by people trying to retain their humanity. Vault 19 contained an experiment in paranoia induction through deliberate community division. The vault was split into red and blue sectors, with the overseers secretly programming different alarm systems, announcement patterns, and environmental controls for each section. The residents were encouraged to identify primarily with their assigned color group, with Vault Tech's goal being to document how artificially created tribal divisions would evolve under controlled conditions. The experiment began with minor differences that escalated through social reinforcement. The red sector received supplies on different schedules than the blue sector, creating competition and suspicion about whether one group was receiving preferential treatment. Alarm systems would trigger in one sector, but not the other, leading each group to question whether the other was lying about vault problems. Over time, these manufactured differences created genuine animosity between groups who shared identical genetics and cultural backgrounds. The paranoia intensified when Vault leadership began spreading rumors that one sector was plotting against the other. Anonymous messages appeared warning about sabotage plans. Missing supplies were blamed on theft by the opposite group, and any mechanical failure was attributed to deliberate action rather than normal wear. The residents internalized these divisions, developing separate cultures, distinct social norms, and eventually different dialects as each sector's language evolved in isolation from the other. Violence erupted when both sectors became convinced that survival required eliminating the threat posed by the other group. The Vault descended into civil war between factions that had been arbitrarily created through color assignment, proving how easily humans will construct enemies from nothing when given even minimal justification. The fighting destroyed much of the vault's infrastructure and killed significant portions of both populations. The survivors eventually discovered evidence of the manipulation, finding Vault Tech documents that detailed the planned division and the methods used to maintain it. This revelation came too late to prevent the damage, instead adding betrayal and shame to the existing trauma of civil war. The vault's remaining residents scattered into the wasteland, unable to remain in a place that represented such profound manipulation, carrying with them wariness about social divisions and the ease with which authority figures could weaponize human tribal instincts. Vault 22 housed botanical experiments that went catastrophically wrong when research into aggressive plant species resulted in the creation of spore carriers and murderous vegetation. The vault's agricultural section was designed to test pest-resistant and rapid-growth plant variants that could help feed the wasteland's recovering population. Instead, the researchers created plant life that viewed humans as either nutrients or obstacles to eliminate. The transformation began subtly as researchers noticed certain plants growing faster than expected and showing unusual responses to stimuli. Some specimens seemed to track movement, others released unusual spores when approached, and a few demonstrated what appeared to be coordinated behavior among separate plants. The scientists, excited by these developments, continued their work without adequate safety protocols, believing they were on the verge of agricultural breakthroughs. The plants eventually escaped their controlled environment, spreading through the vault's ventilation systems and common areas. The spores they released infected vault residents, beginning a transformation process that turned humans into spore carriers who existed in symbiosis with the aggressive plant life. These infected individuals lost higher cognitive function, but retained enough motor control to spread the infection, shambling through the vault's corridors and attacking anyone who tried to resist or escape. The few survivors who managed to flee the vault carried spores with them, unknowingly spreading the contamination to other areas of the wasteland. The plants established themselves in Zion Canyon and other locations, creating zones where the vegetation actively hunted humans. The botanical nightmare that emerged from Vault 22's experiments demonstrated the dangers of biological research without adequate containment, showing how easily scientific advancement could become an apocalyptic threat. The long-term legacy of Vault 22 extended beyond the immediate danger of killer plants. The spore carriers represented a new form of life that blurred the line between plant and animal, human and vegetation, creating philosophical questions about consciousness and identity that the wasteland wasn't equipped to answer. The vault's failure showed that some pre-war scientific ambitions were too dangerous to pursue, that humanity's hunger for progress could create monsters more terrifying than radiation ever produced. Vault 101 served as the primary setting for Fallout 3, housing an experiment in authority and controlled evolution. The vault was designed to never open, with its overseer position passed down through generations of a single family who maintained absolute power over the isolated community. Vault Tech wanted to study how dynastic authority would develop in complete isolation, whether the overseer's bloodline would evolve into benevolent shepherds or tyrants ruling through inherited privilege. The vault's culture developed around reverence for the overseer position, with residents taught from childhood that questioning authority endangered everyone's survival. The overseer's family lived in separate quarters with better amenities, creating a visible class division that was justified as necessary for maintaining leadership clarity. This hierarchy became so deeply ingrained that most residents couldn't imagine alternatives, their worldviews shaped by generations of conditioning. The GECK device, stored in the vault, represented Vault-Tech's contingency plan, though its existence was kept secret from most residents. The overseer's family knew about the device and the vault's true purpose, but maintained the fiction of permanent isolation to preserve the experiment. This deception created a situation where the leaders actively worked against their community's best interests to satisfy Vault Tech's research goals, prioritizing data collection over human welfare. The lone wanderer's departure shattered the Vault's controlled environment, introducing outside knowledge that undermined the carefully maintained social structure. The overseer's violent response to this breach revealed how much the Vault's stability depended on ignorance and isolation, how the entire society would collapse if residents learned they could leave. The subsequent opening of the vault proved the overseer right in some ways, as the sudden freedom created social chaos among people unprepared for choice. The long-term impact on Vault 101's residents was mixed. Some adapted to the wasteland and found purpose outside the vault's rigid hierarchy, while others struggled with the loss of structure and certainty. The vault's experiment succeeded in creating a stable, isolated society, but failed to prepare its residents for anything beyond those narrow parameters, producing people who were simultaneously too trusting and too fearful to navigate the wasteland's complexities effectively. Vault 87 contained one of the most consequential experiments in the entire Fallout universe. The vault was designated as a research facility for the forced evolutionary virus, with the goal of creating super soldiers through controlled mutation. The residents were never informed about the true purpose of their facility, believing themselves to be in a standard vault until the experiments began. Vault Tech's partnership with military research programs turned the entire population into unwilling test subjects. The initial FEV exposures created super mutants, beings of tremendous physical strength but often diminished intelligence. The transformation process was agonizing, with subjects experiencing rapid cellular restructuring that destroyed their former identities while enhancing their physical capabilities. The Vault's staff continued the experiments, despite the obvious suffering, documenting the results while ignoring the ethical implications of their work. The super mutants that emerged from Vault 87 retained little memory of their human lives, their cognitive changes having destroyed most personal history and emotional connection. Some retained enough awareness to experience the loss of their humanity, trapped in bodies they didn't recognize with thoughts they couldn't fully articulate. The tragedy of FEV mutation lay not just in the physical transformation, but in the destruction of self that accompanied it. The vault's location in the capital wasteland became ground zero for super mutant activity as the transformed residents broke free and began capturing other humans for conversion. The FEV experiments spread beyond Vault Tech's control, creating a self-perpetuating population of super mutants who viewed forced mutation as salvation rather than curse. The Vault's legacy became a persistent threat to human survival in the region. The moral questions raised by Vault 87 extended beyond the initial experiments. The super mutants created there were victims of Vault Tech's research, but their subsequent actions in capturing and converting other humans complicated simple narratives of blame. The Vault showed how victimization could transform into perpetration, how suffering could be passed on rather than ended, creating cycles of harm that extended far beyond the original crime. Vault 74 explored social adaptation through equipment malfunctions, deliberately designing critical systems to fail at inopportune moments to study how communities respond to recurring crises. The Vault's residents faced constant emergencies from failing water purifiers, malfunctioning life support, and breaking power systems, all problems that Vault Tech engineers had deliberately created through design flaws and sabotaged components. The community developed a crisis response culture where emergency became normal and stability was only temporary. Residents learned to stockpile resources against the next inevitable failure, creating hoarding behaviors that persisted even during periods of adequate supply. Social trust eroded as people competed for limited resources during each crisis, making cooperation difficult even when systems were functioning normally. The constant stress created psychological profiles marked by hypervigilance and difficulty relaxing. Residents reported sleeping poorly due to anxiety about the next emergency, developing health problems related to sustained stress hormone elevation. Children raised in this environment showed developmental issues related to feeling perpetually unsafe, their formative years shaped by recurring catastrophes that adults should have been able to prevent, but somehow never could. The vault's maintenance workers suffered particularly severe psychological damage, blamed by other residents for failures they had no power to prevent. The sabotaged systems were designed to be unrepairable with available resources, creating situations where workers could diagnose problems but not fix them. This powerlessness, combined with constant criticism, drove many maintenance staff to mental breakdowns or suicide. The experiment ultimately showed that humans adapt poorly to environments of constant crisis, that resilience has limits that chronic stress exceeds. The residents who survived developed trauma responses that made normal life difficult, their crisis-adapted behaviors becoming maladaptive when applied to stable environments. Vault Tech documented exactly how recurring emergencies destroy communities, though whether they cared about the human cost of this knowledge remained questionable. Vault 36 contained perhaps the most ethically troubling experiment in reproductive control. The vault's genetic database was deliberately corrupted, causing the vault's reproductive technology to produce offspring with genetic abnormalities at far higher rates than natural reproduction would. Vault Tech wanted to study how a community would handle having significant portions of each generation born with disabilities or genetic conditions that required extra resources to support. The Vault's culture developed around collective care for affected children, with significant resources dedicated to medical treatment and adaptive technologies. However, this noble response came with darker undercurrents, as some residents questioned whether the Vault could sustain such efforts across multiple generations. Debates emerged about reproductive selection, with some arguing that knowingly creating disabled children was cruel, while others insisted every life had equal value, regardless of ability. The pressure on families with affected children was immense, dealing with both the practical challenges of care and the social judgment from other residents who viewed their choices to reproduce despite known risks as selfish. Some families retreated into isolation, others became advocates for better support systems, and a few broke under the combined stress of caregiving and social condemnation. The long-term demographic pressure threatened the Vault's sustainability, as increasing portions of each generation required specialized support. Resources that should have maintained general infrastructure were diverted to medical care, creating deteriorating conditions for everyone. The Vault faced the prospect of collapse, not from equipment failure or resource shortage, but from demographic composition that exceeded the community's capacity to support. The experiment forced impossible ethical questions about reproduction, disability, resources, and what communities owe to their most vulnerable members. Vault Tech's clinical documentation of these debates revealed their interest in moral philosophy under pressure, treating profound questions of human value as data points to collect. The Vault's residents grappled with dilemmas that had no right answers, only tragic choices between different forms of harm. Vault 42 demonstrated Vault Tech's interest in sensory deprivation, specifically the absence of entertainment and creative outlets. The Vault was equipped with only one recreational item, a single deck of playing cards for the entire population. All other forms of entertainment, from books to musical instruments to sports equipment, were deliberately excluded. The experiment aimed to document how humans would cope with extreme boredom and the lack of creative expression. The first years were marked by intense competition for access to the playing cards, with elaborate scheduling systems and conflicts over usage rights. The cards themselves became sacred objects, their condition maintained with obsessive care as they represented the only official relief from monotony. Some residents memorized every card, could identify individual cards by minor imperfections, and developed elaborate games that extracted maximum entertainment from minimal materials. Creativity emerged through desperation as residents found unauthorized ways to occupy their time. They created art from scavenged materials, composed songs without instruments, told stories that evolved into oral traditions, and developed physical games that required no equipment. The vault's culture became intensely creative, specifically because official outlets were denied, with residents finding meaning and expression through whatever materials they could repurpose. However, the lack of sanctioned creative outlets took psychological toll. Many residents reported feeling empty or purposeless during leisure time, their brains unable to rest because boredom felt too similar to wasting life. Depression became widespread as people struggled to find meaning in existence that offered so few sources of joy or beauty. The vault's suicide rate climbed as some residents concluded that life without enrichment wasn't worth sustaining. The experiment succeeded in showing that humans need creative expression as much as they need food and water, that denying artistic or entertaining outlets causes psychological damage that affects overall health and community stability. The residents who eventually left Vault 42 carried intense appreciation for art, music, and play, having experienced their absence. They also carried trauma from years of enforced monotony, making it difficult for them to ever truly relax or feel that leisure was acceptable rather than wasteful. Vault 56 housed an experiment in extreme weather simulation, with environmental controls creating artificial seasons that became increasingly severe over time. The vault began with comfortable temperatures, but gradually introduced extreme heat and cold cycles that tested the limits of human adaptation. Vault Tech wanted to study how communities would maintain cohesion when facing environmental hostility that couldn't be escaped or overcome. The residents adapted initially by developing seasonal routines, moving between different vault sections that offered slightly better conditions during extreme periods. However, as the temperature swings intensified beyond what clothing or behavior could mitigate, the community faced periods where simply surviving required most of their energy. During extreme heat waves, residents became lethargic and irritable, while extreme cold drove them into huddled groups that strained social bonds through forced proximity. The temperature extremes created health problems that the vault's medical facilities struggled to address. Heat stroke and dehydration during hot periods were followed by frostbite and hypothermia during cold periods, creating cyclical medical crises that depleted supplies and expertise. The elderly and young suffered most severely, with each temperature extreme claiming lives from the most vulnerable populations. Social cohesion deteriorated as the environmental stress overrode communal bonds. During extreme periods, residents hoarded resources, fought over access to slightly less hostile areas, and abandoned social norms in favor of personal survival. The vault's culture became defined by these extreme periods rather than the moderate temperatures between them, with all social planning oriented around surviving the next environmental crisis. The long-term survivors developed remarkable physical adaptations to temperature stress, their bodies becoming more efficient at thermoregulation through years of extreme exposure. However, these adaptations came at cost to other bodily systems, with many residents experiencing premature aging and chronic health conditions related to sustained physiological stress. The vault proved that humans could adapt to hostile environments, but would pay for that adaptation with shortened lifespans and reduced quality of life. Vault 79 contained an experiment in false scarcity, where resources were actually abundant but carefully hidden, while residents were told supplies were critically limited. Vault-Tec wanted to study how scarcity mindset affected behavior, whether people would remain selfish and competitive even when objective need didn't require it. The vault maintained secret stockpiles while enforcing strict rationing, creating artificial desperation among people who were never actually in danger of running out of essentials. The scarcity conditioning worked exactly as designed, creating a culture of hoarding and competition despite adequate resources. Residents developed elaborate strategies for stretching their rations, created black markets for trading small amounts of supplies, and judged each other's consumption harshly. The psychological scarcity became real, even though material scarcity was manufactured, proving how powerfully perception shapes behavior regardless of objective reality. Some residents discovered the hidden stockpiles, creating a crisis of trust that threatened to tear the community apart. Those who learned the truth faced impossible choices about whether to reveal the deception, knowing that disclosure would destroy faith in vault leadership, but keeping silent meant allowing artificial suffering to continue. The conflict between truth and stability became the vault's defining tension. The revelation, when it finally came, devastated the community's social fabric. Residents felt betrayed, not just by Vault-Tec, but by their own overseer who had maintained the deception. Relationships built on shared sacrifice felt hollow when the sacrifice proved unnecessary. The Vault's entire moral framework, built around conservation and fair distribution of scarce resources, became meaningless when scarcity itself was revealed as manufactured. The long-term psychological damage from this experiment proved severe, with survivors unable to trust authority or believe official reports about resource availability. They developed hoarding behaviors that persisted even in environments with clear abundance, their scarcity mindset too deeply ingrained to overcome through evidence. The vault demonstrated how artificial scarcity could damage communities as thoroughly as real deprivation, showing that the perception of limitation was itself a powerful force for harm. Vault 96 was designed to study the effects of sonic weaponry on confined populations, using subsonic frequencies that humans couldn't consciously hear but that affected mood, sleep, and cognitive function. The vault's residents experienced these effects without knowing their source, attributing their psychological changes to vault life stress rather than deliberate sonic manipulation. Vault-Tec collected data on how these weapons could be used for crowd control or psychological warfare. The effects manifested as widespread anxiety, sleep disturbances, and difficulty concentrating. Residents reported feeling watched, experiencing paranoia without clear cause, and developing vague fears that they couldn't articulate or rationalize. The subsonic frequencies created physiological stress responses that bypassed conscious awareness, making the residents feel threatened without understanding why. Medical staff documented increasing rates of stress-related illnesses, but couldn't identify a common cause since the sonic weapons left no physical evidence. The mystery of shared symptoms led to theories about contamination or conspiracy, actually intensifying the psychological pressure as residents searched for explanations that didn't exist. The vault's culture became defined by unexplained collective suffering that no one could prevent or treat. Children exposed to the sonic weapons during developmental periods showed lasting effects including heightened anxiety responses and difficulty with emotional regulation. Their brains developed in an environment of constant low-level threat, shaping neural patterns that persisted even after sonic exposure ended. The second generation carried psychological scars from weapons they never knew existed. The revelation of the sonic experiments came only when maintenance workers accidentally discovered the devices during unrelated repairs. The community's reaction combined rage at the deception with relief at finally understanding their suffering's source. However, knowing the cause didn't undo the damage, leaving residents with trauma from years of manipulation and the knowledge that their entire vault experience had been weaponized against them. Vault 107 experimented with complete isolation of the overseer, placing vault leadership in a sealed chamber with no direct communication with residents. The overseer could observe the vault through monitors and issue commands through text displays, but never speak to or physically interact with the people under their authority. Vault Tech wanted to study how leadership without human connection would develop and whether communities would follow orders from an invisible authority. The arrangement created a leadership vacuum despite the overseer's technical presence. Residents developed their own power structures around interpreting and implementing the overseer's text commands, creating a bureaucratic class that mediated between the isolated leader and the general population. These interpreters wielded significant power by controlling information flow in both directions, translating the overseer's commands and filtering what information reached leadership. The overseer's isolation led to increasingly disconnected decision-making. Without direct observation of how policies affected people, leadership became abstract and theoretical, optimizing for efficiency metrics rather than human welfare. Commands became rigid and inflexible, lacking the nuance that face-to-face interaction provides. The overseer essentially became an AI made of human consciousness, making decisions without emotional input or social awareness. The vault's residents began to doubt whether a real person existed in the overseer's chamber at all, developing theories that they were being led by a computer program or that the chamber was empty and commands were automated. This uncertainty undermined authority as people questioned whether they should follow orders from what might be a machine. The experiment revealed how much leadership depends on perceived humanity, how authority requires some form of social connection to maintain legitimacy. The ultimate failure came when the overseer died in the sealed chamber, leaving no designated replacement because the succession system required physical presence. The vault continued receiving commands from whoever accessed the overseer's terminal, creating a situation where anyone could pretend to be vault leadership. The experiment demonstrated that isolation destroys not just the isolated individual, but the entire system that depends on their participation, showing how leadership requires connection to remain functional. The final moments of many vault experiments often revealed Vault Tech's true priorities, how data collection mattered more than human survival or ethical consideration. Each vault's sealed door represented not just physical barrier, but moral boundary that Vault Tech crossed by treating informed consent as obstacle rather than requirement. The residents who suffered through these experiments never agreed to be test subjects, their trust weaponized against them. Vault 76 represented something different among Vault Tech's facilities. Designated as a control vault with minimal experimental modification, it was designed to open 25 years after the bombs fell, releasing its residents to reclaim and rebuild Appalachia. The vault's population consisted of carefully selected high achievers given extensive training in survival, construction, agriculture, and community organization. Vault Tech's experiment with Vault 76 wasn't about torture or social stress, but about studying whether optimal conditions and preparation could create successful wasteland reclamation. The residents spent their 25 years underground training for Reclamation Day, developing skills and knowledge specifically tailored to rebuilding civilization. They studied pre-war agriculture, learned to maintain advanced technology, practiced conflict resolution, and prepared psychologically for the challenges they would face upon emergence. The Vault created a culture of optimism and purpose where everyone understood their role in humanity's recovery. When the doors finally opened, the residents emerged as the most prepared Vault dwellers in the entire experiment series. They carried not just supplies and knowledge, but also hope, believing that their careful preparation would allow them to succeed where others had failed. The first days of freedom felt like validation, as trained teams efficiently established initial camps and began surveying the surrounding territory. However, the wasteland proved more complex than training could fully prepare them for. The residents encountered threats that hadn't existed in Vault-Tech's curriculum, from scorch beasts to other survivor factions with incompatible goals. Some Vault dwellers thrived in this environment, their training providing foundation for creative problem solving. Others struggled with the gap between simulation and reality, discovering that preparation couldn't eliminate the fundamental unpredictability of post-apocalyptic survival. The ironic success of Vault 76 lay in how its residents eventually abandoned their planned, coordinated rebuilding in favor of individualistic approaches. Despite training in cooperative community development, they scattered across Appalachia pursuing personal visions of reconstruction. Some established trading posts, others became wandering problem solvers, a few formed raider gangs, and many simply tried to survive day by day. The Vault's experiment proved that even optimal preparation couldn't override human nature's tendency toward individual autonomy over collective planning. The legacy of Vault experiments extends beyond the immediate suffering of residents to the broader wasteland impact. Every faction that emerged from Vault origins, from the New California Republic to the Brotherhood of Steel, carried ideological DNA shaped by their Vault experience. The experiments didn't just study human behavior, but actively shaped it, creating the social forces that would define post-war civilization. The moral weight of Vault-Tech's actions becomes heavier when considering the alternatives that existed. The resources spent on elaborate experiments could have created genuine sanctuaries, saving lives and preserving knowledge without the suffering. The company chose data over humanity, viewing the apocalypse as opportunity rather than tragedy, treating survivors as subjects rather than people deserving of protection. The vaults stand as monuments to corporate ethics divorced from human consideration, where profit and research justified any level of suffering. Each sealed door represented a choice to prioritize information gathering over informed consent, to value data points over human dignity. The experiments succeeded in producing knowledge about human behavior under extreme stress, but at a cost that no ethical framework could justify. The Wasteland's survivors learned to view vault doors with suspicion, understanding that Vault-Tech's promises of safety often concealed nightmares. The vaults became symbols of pre-war corruption, demonstrating how the same society that created nuclear weapons also created systems of deliberate human suffering. The experiments showed that the bombs weren't the only way the old world destroyed itself. Some vaults remained sealed even centuries after the war, their experiments presumably continuing in darkness, where no one can observe or intervene. The wasteland contains unknown numbers of facilities where people might still be suffering through scenarios designed by engineers who died long ago, automated systems maintaining cruelty across generations. Each unopened vault represents potential tragedy, human lives consumed by experiments that serve no purpose now that the organization running them has ceased to exist. The few control vaults that functioned as intended demonstrated what could have been achieved if Vault-Tech had prioritized survival over experimentation. These facilities preserved knowledge, protected people, and contributed to wasteland recovery in ways that validated the original vault concept. Their success makes the experimental vault's suffering even more tragic, proving that the company possessed the capability to help, but chose research instead. The ultimate lesson of the vault experiments lies not in the specific data they produced, but in what they revealed about human nature when given unchecked power over others. Vault-Tech's researchers, engineers, and executives all participated in designing suffering, convinced that their scientific or corporate purposes justified the means. The vaults became laboratories for studying not just vault dwellers, but the people who created the experiments, documenting how easily educated professionals could rationalize cruelty when insulated from direct observation of the harm they caused. The psychological distance between researcher and subject allowed Vault Tech to treat vault dwellers as less than fully human, reducing them to variables in experiments whose outcomes mattered more than the people experiencing them. This same distancing mechanism appears throughout human history wherever people with power have felt entitled to use those without power for purposes those subjects never consented to. The vaults represent the apocalypse's clearest example of this pattern, but not its only instance. The children born in the vaults inherited experiments they never agreed to, their entire lives shaped by decisions made before they existed. These second and third generation vault dwellers suffered for research that couldn't even claim their parents' consent, showing how Vault Tech's violations compounded across time. The experiments didn't just harm individuals, but corrupted entire lineages, creating inherited trauma that passed through generations alongside genetic material. Some Vault experiments became self-perpetuating, continuing long after Vault Tech oversight ended. The Gary clones kept producing. The virtual reality torture maintained power despite its creator's possible death. The super mutant conversions spread beyond the original facility. These ongoing experiments demonstrated how certain types of harm, once initiated, develop momentum that doesn't require continued input from originators. Vault Tech created systems of suffering that outlasted the company itself. The Wasteland's various factions respond differently to Vault legacy. The Brotherhood of Steel sees the vaults as treasure troves of technology to preserve, often overlooking the human cost of acquiring that knowledge. The New California Republic treats vaults as historical sites, sometimes protecting them as monuments to pre-war hubris. Raiders view them as resource caches, caring nothing for the stories sealed inside. Each response reflects different values about whether the past should be remembered or exploited. Individual vault survivors carry their experiences differently. Some become advocates for remembering and preventing future experiments, ensuring that the suffering wasn't meaningless by using it to teach lessons. Others prefer to forget, building new identities that have no connection to their vault origins. A few embrace their vault heritage as source of strength, arguing that surviving the experiments proved their resilience. No single response fits all survivors, as trauma affects each person uniquely. The question of whether Vault Tech's research produced any valuable knowledge remains controversial among wasteland scholars. Some argue that understanding human behavior under extreme stress has practical applications for managing current communities. Others counter that knowledge gained through such unethical means is permanently tainted, that using it validates the methods that produced it. The debate mirrors similar historical controversies about research obtained through human suffering. The physical vaults continue to shape the wasteland landscape, their structures too durable to easily destroy, and too potentially valuable to abandon completely. Scavengers pick through accessible vaults for technology and supplies, while settlers sometimes claim cleared facilities as defensible housing. The vaults transition from experimental chambers to utilitarian structures, their original purposes fading as practical needs override historical memory. The sealed doors that once protected experiments now protect mysteries, as many vaults remain unexplored centuries after the war. Each unopened facility represents unknown stories, suffering that occurred beyond observation, experiments that might have succeeded or failed without documentation. The wasteland contains vault secrets that will likely never be discovered, lost to time and structural decay that finally grants privacy to those who deserved it from the beginning. The vault experiment's documentation exists in scattered fragments across the wasteland, with some files preserved in working computer systems, while others deteriorate on paper in abandoned offices. These records serve as evidence of what occurred, but also as warnings about what could occur again if similar power structures emerge. The wasteland's survivors must decide whether to preserve this knowledge or destroy it, whether remembering serves justice or risks inspiring repetition. Some vaults achieved outcomes that surprised even vault tech, producing results that complicated simple narratives about success or failure. Communities that should have collapsed according to predictions found unexpected ways to adapt. Experiments designed to create specific behaviors sometimes generated opposite reactions. The vaults proved that human behavior resists complete prediction, that people retain agency even in situations designed to eliminate it. The diversity of vault experiments reflected Vault Tech's comprehensive approach to studying human nature, attempting to isolate variables that interact in complex ways during normal life. Each vault targeted specific aspects of psychology or society, creating a collective portrait of human behavior under every conceivable stress. The company treated humanity like a machine to be disassembled and analyzed, ignoring how the disassembly process destroyed the very phenomena they claimed to study. The long-term health effects of vault life varied by facility, but generally included problems related to enclosed spaces, recycled air, limited nutrition variety, and psychological stress. Physical ailments were often documented meticulously as part of experimental data, providing detailed records of how vault conditions affected human bodies over time. These health records, when discovered, offer grim reading about preventable suffering that Vault Tech observed without intervening. The social hierarchies that developed in vaults reflected both pre-war inequalities and new systems created by experimental conditions. Some vaults maintained class structures from outside, while others developed new stratifications based on vault-specific factors. The overseer position concentrated power in ways that often led to abuse, as isolated authority without external oversight rarely restrains itself. The vaults became microcosms of broader questions about power, showing how quickly societies develop exploitation when circumstances permit. The psychological concept of learned helplessness applies to many vault populations, where repeated experiences of powerlessness taught residents that resistance was futile. This conditioning served Vault Tech's experimental purposes by reducing interference with vault operations, but it also created populations unable to advocate for themselves or recognize opportunities for change. The vaults demonstrated how environments can be structured to destroy agency, making people complicit in their own oppression. Some vault dwellers developed remarkable resilience, despite experimental conditions, finding meaning and hope in circumstances designed to destroy both. These individuals often became leaders after vault opening, their ability to maintain humanity through dehumanizing experiences giving them moral authority. Their survival with dignity intact represented a form of resistance against Vault Tech's intentions, proving that human spirit could endure even systematic efforts to break it. The children's experiences in experimental vaults deserve particular attention as they faced suffering without the adult context to understand or rationalize it. Young minds developed around experimental conditions, accepting as normal circumstances that should have been recognized as aberrant. Some vault children never learned that life could be different, their entire worldview shaped by whatever experiment surrounded them. The long-term psychological impact on these individuals remains poorly understood, as many never received anything resembling therapeutic intervention. The role of vault overseers complicated simple narratives about victims and perpetrators. Some overseers genuinely believed they were protecting their communities, unaware of experimental designs that used their authority for purposes they hadn't consented to. Others knew the truth and participated anyway, either from fear of Vault Tech or from belief that the experiments served greater good. A few actively resisted, sabotaging experiments where possible despite personal risk. Each overseer's choices reflected individual ethics tested under impossible circumstances. The maintenance staff and medical personnel in vaults often faced the most acute moral dilemmas. They possessed knowledge about vault operations that regular residents lacked, sometimes discovering experimental designs through technical documentation. Their professional roles required them to either maintain systems they knew were harmful or refuse and face consequences that could endanger everyone. The records left by these workers reveal the psychological burden of complicity, the impossibility of abstaining when abstention itself becomes participation. The genetic legacy of vault populations presents complex questions for wasteland communities. Generations of isolation created genetic bottlenecks in some vaults, while others deliberately mixed populations or introduced genetic modifications. The long-term health implications of these population effects continue to manifest in descendants who never lived in vaults themselves. The experiment's reach extends through bloodlines, affecting people born long after the facilities opened. The preservation of pre-war knowledge in vaults created an uneven distribution of information across the wasteland. Some communities emerged from vaults with extensive libraries and technical documentation, while others survivors had only oral traditions and practical experience. This knowledge disparity shaped power dynamics in the recovering world, giving vault communities advantages in technology and organization that translated into political influence. The vault's role in preserving civilization came with questions about who got to define what civilization meant. The failure of many vault experiments to produce useful data for their stated purposes raises questions about vault tech's true motivations. If the experiments were genuinely about gathering research for future colonization or social engineering, the haphazard documentation and poor experimental controls would seem like critical flaws. This suggests either that vault tech was less competent than their public image claimed, or that the experiments served purposes beyond their official justifications, perhaps satisfying curiosity or demonstrating technical capabilities rather than pursuing coherent research goals. The vault's interaction with the wasteland after opening created unpredictable outcomes that vault tech couldn't have anticipated. Vault dwellers bringing their experiences and cultures into contact with surface survivors generated new social formations that combined elements from both origins. The resulting hybrid communities sometimes achieved what neither group could have alone, demonstrating unexpected benefits from diversity that emerged accidentally rather than through planning. The economic impact of accessible vaults included both resource windfalls and conflicts over vault ownership. Communities located near valuable vaults gained access to technology, medical supplies, and preserved goods that provided significant advantages over more isolated groups. These disparities sometimes led to wars over vault control, with factions fighting for access to facilities that previous occupants had died trying to escape. The vaults became sources of conflict even after their experimental purposes ended. The symbolic meaning of vaults evolved as wasteland communities developed their own traditions and mythologies. Some cultures treat vaults as sacred sites where ancestors endured trials, while others view them as cursed places to be avoided. The physical vaults become invested with meanings their builders never intended, serving new purposes in post-war societies that have forgotten or rejected the old world's values. The question of justice for vault experiments remains largely unresolved, as vault tech's destruction means the guilty parties escaped accountability. Survivors must reconcile knowing that those responsible for their suffering died without consequences, that no trial will ever hold anyone accountable for the deliberate cruelty inflicted across generations. This unresolved trauma shapes attitudes toward authority and institutions throughout the wasteland. The parallels between vault experiments and historical human rights violations aren't coincidental, as Vault Tech's researchers likely studied previous atrocities for methodological inspiration. The vaults represent the culmination of traditions of unethical research, incorporating lessons from every previous instance of powerful organizations exploiting vulnerable populations. Understanding the vaults requires recognizing them as part of broader patterns of institutional violence. The resistance that occurred within some vaults demonstrated that experimental designs couldn't completely eliminate human agency or moral sense. Despite power imbalances and information control, some residents recognized wrong and acted against it, sabotaging experiments at personal cost. These acts of resistance rarely changed vault outcomes, but proved that compliance isn't inevitable, that people retain capacity for ethical action even under conditions designed to eliminate it. The documentation of vault life through personal logs, terminal entries, and recorded messages provides intimate perspectives on experimental suffering. These first-person accounts transform abstract experimental designs into human stories, recording the thoughts and feelings of people as they experienced what Vault Tech had planned for them. Reading these documents centuries later creates uncomfortable connection across time, hearing voices of people who died believing no one would ever know their stories. Vault 85 experimented with external surveillance, installing cameras throughout the facility, but deliberately making them obvious and intrusive. Every room contained visible monitoring equipment, with red lights indicating constant recording and speakers that occasionally reminded residents they were being watched. Vault-Tec wanted to study how constant awareness of surveillance would affect behavior, privacy expectations, and social development across generations who had never known unwatched moments. The residents initially found the surveillance disturbing, but adapted through various coping mechanisms. Some performed for the cameras, treating their lives as ongoing shows for invisible audiences. Others attempted to find blind spots or developed codes and gestures to communicate without surveillance detection. The younger generation, raised under cameras, developed differently from their parents, lacking the concept of privacy that pre-war society had taken for granted. The psychological impact manifested in complex ways. Some residents became exhibitionists, unable to function without the validation of knowing they were watched. Others developed severe anxiety about being observed, experiencing panic attacks triggered by the camera lights. The vault's culture split between those who accepted surveillance as normal and those who viewed it as constant violation, creating social divisions based on surveillance attitudes. The most profound effect appeared in the vault's second generation, children who never experienced privacy and therefore couldn't conceptualize it as something they lacked. They developed differently from humans raised with private spaces, their sense of self more performative and less internally focused. These children grew into adults who treated constant observation as an environmental feature like air or gravity, neither good nor bad, but simply present. The experiment revealed how thoroughly surveillance shapes human development and social structures. The vault's residents became either paranoid about observation or indifferent to it, with few finding healthy middle ground. Their relationships were performances. Their private thoughts had no private space to exist, and their sense of individual identity became inseparable from how they imagined observers perceived them. Vault 43 housed an experiment in leadership chaos, where the overseer position changed every week through random selection rather than election or appointment. No one could serve as overseer twice, and the position carried absolute authority during the 7 days it was held. Vault-Tec wanted to study how communities would function under constantly changing leadership with no continuity or accountability. The first months descended into chaos as each new overseer attempted to implement their vision before their week expired. Policies changed constantly, with rules from one week being reversed the next, creating an environment where residents never knew what regulations they were supposed to follow. The only consistent element was inconsistency, as each overseer's personality and priorities shaped their brief reign. Some overseers used their week to settle personal scores, others attempted grandiose projects that couldn't be completed in 7 days, and a few simply enjoyed the power trip before returning to ordinary status. The lack of consequences for poor decisions encouraged reckless leadership, as overseers knew they would never face accountability once their week ended. The vault became ungovernable as residents learned to ignore or circumvent whatever the current overseer demanded. The long-term effect created a population that trusted no authority and followed no leadership. Residents developed informal power structures that operated beneath the official overseer system, creating a shadow government that maintained actual continuity while pretending to obey whoever temporarily held the title. The vault's culture became cynical about leadership in general, viewing all authority as temporary and largely irrelevant to actual survival. The experiment demonstrated that leadership requires both accountability and continuity to function effectively. Random rotation destroyed both, creating authority that was simultaneously absolute and meaningless. The residents learned to govern themselves through consensus and informal agreements, finding that anarchic cooperation worked better than tyrannical chaos. Vault 55 contained an experiment in artificial scarcity cycling, where different resources would become critically short on rotating schedules. 1 month water would be rationed severely while food was abundant. The next month food would be limited while water flowed freely. The pattern was designed to prevent adaptation, keeping residents in constant state of managing whichever crisis was currently active while preparing for the next one. The psychological toll of never-ending resource crises created a population that couldn't relax even during abundant periods. Residents hoarded whatever was currently plentiful, knowing scarcity was coming for that resource soon. Social bonds deteriorated as people competed for resources during each crisis period, making cooperation difficult even when it would benefit everyone. The children raised in this environment developed anxiety disorders related to resource security, unable to feel safe even when supplies were adequate. They learned from their parents that plenty was temporary illusion, that scarcity was the default state requiring constant vigilance and preparation. This conditioning created adults who could never enjoy abundance, always saving for crises that would inevitably arrive. The vault's economy developed around predicting and trading for the next scarcity. Residents who accurately anticipated which resource would be limited next could acquire it while still abundant and trade it during the shortage for significant gain. This created a speculative market where information about the scarcity schedule became the most valuable commodity, leading to espionage and information control that added another layer of social dysfunction. The experiment succeeded in creating a population adapted to perpetual crisis, but incapable of thriving during stability. The residents carried their scarcity mindset into the wasteland, where actual resource limitations reinforced behaviors that had been artificially induced. They couldn't recognize when they had enough, always preparing for the next shortage that their vault conditioning told them must be coming. Vault 91 experimented with complete gender segregation, splitting the vault into separate sections for men and women with no contact permitted between them. Each section had its own overseer, resources, and social structure, with Vault Tech monitoring how the isolated gender communities would develop differently. The experiment aimed to study whether gender differences were innate or socially constructed by observing how communities developed without opposite-sex influence. The segregated communities developed distinct cultures that reflected both gender socialization from the pre-war world and adaptations to their specific circumstances. The women's section organized around collaborative decision-making and consensus building, creating a relatively egalitarian structure. The men's section developed more hierarchical organization with clear power structures and competition for status. However, both sections faced challenges that gender balanced communities wouldn't have experienced. The reproductive implications became crisis within a generation. The segregated communities couldn't naturally reproduce, forcing difficult decisions about whether to request artificial insemination or whether reproduction should occur at all, given the circumstances. Some residents argued that bringing children into the segregated environment was cruel, while others insisted that refusing to reproduce meant accepting vault extinction. The psychological impact of isolation from half the human population manifested in various ways. Some residents romanticized the absent gender, creating idealized fantasies divorced from reality. Others developed hostility toward the concept of the opposite sex, blaming them for the segregation despite both groups being equally victimized by Vault-Tech's design. A few questioned whether gender categories had meaning in communities organized entirely without reference to them. The experiment's outcome complicated simplistic narratives about gender differences, showing both persistent patterns and significant variations that suggested complex interplay between biology and culture. The vault's segregated populations developed differently, but not always in ways that matched pre-war stereotypes, suggesting that much of gendered behavior stems from mixed-gender social dynamics rather than inherent traits. Vault 39 contained an experiment in mandatory rotation of living spaces where residents were forced to move to different quarters every month and with no ability to personalize or claim any space as permanently their own. Vault-Tech wanted to study how lack of permanent residence would affect psychological well-being, community formation, and sense of identity. The constant relocation prevented residents from forming attachments to physical spaces or accumulating personal belongings beyond what they could easily carry. The vault's culture became nomadic despite being enclosed in a single facility, with people never fully unpacking or settling because they knew displacement was coming. This created a population without sense of home, even though they never left the vault. Children raised in rotating quarters struggled with object permanence and spatial memory development. They couldn't form the mental maps of familiar territory that normally help children develop confidence and independence. The monthly moves disrupted social relationships as friends and family members were scattered to different sections, making it difficult to maintain consistent contact. The psychological impact included increased anxiety about change, difficulty forming stable relationships, and persistent feeling of impermanence. Residents reported dreams about finding a place to stay, about claiming a space that couldn't be taken away, suggesting that the denial of permanent residence created deep psychological wounds. The human need for territory and stable environment was revealed through its deliberate violation. The experiment demonstrated that home serves psychological functions beyond simple shelter. The inability to personalize space or count on continuity of location created identity issues and social fragmentation. The vault's residents never developed the sense of belonging that comes from familiar surroundings, instead, feeling perpetually displaced in their own facility. Vault 72 experimented with complete isolation of age groups, segregating children, adults, and elderly into separate vault sections with minimal contact between generations. Vault-Tech wanted to study how each age group would develop without the influence, support, or burden of other generations. The elderly section struggled with lack of young energy and assistance. The adult section dealt with caring for children while managing vault operations, and the children's section faced growing up without elder wisdom or parental guidance. The children's section became a Lord of the Flies scenario where young residents raised themselves with only vault staff supervision. They developed a culture that had minimal connection to pre-war traditions, creating new social structures based on their limited understanding and the dynamics of peer-only society. Many reached adulthood with significant developmental gaps, having missed the guidance that previous generations provided. The elderly section became a repository of knowledge with no one to pass it to. Residents watched their accumulated wisdom become irrelevant as they had no younger generations to teach. The isolation created depression and sense of purposelessness, as their traditional role as mentors and tradition keepers was denied by the vault's design. The adult section bore the heaviest burden, managing all vault operations while raising children without elder support. They experienced constant stress from balancing work and childcare, unable to seek advice from more experienced generations or pass difficult children to grandparents for respite. The complete responsibility for everything created burnout and resentment. The experiment proved that multi-generational contact serves crucial functions for all age groups. Children need adult guidance and elder wisdom. Adults need the energy of youth and perspective of age, and the elderly need purpose through connection to continuing generations. The isolation created dysfunction in all three sections, showing how thoroughly humans depend on generational continuity. Vault 45 contained an experiment in reversed sleep schedules, where half the population was required to be awake during night hours and sleep during day hours, despite the vault having no natural light cycle. The reversed schedule was enforced through work shifts and social programming, creating a population that never interacted with the other half, despite sharing the same facility. The split schedule created two separate communities, occupying the same physical space at different times. The day shift residents developed their own culture and social structures, as did the night shift, with minimal overlap or shared experience. Couples were sometimes assigned to different shifts, forcing them to choose between sleep and time together. Families were split across schedules, with parents and children living on opposite cycles. The psychological impact of shift work is well documented in pre-war research, but the vault's experiment pushed it to extremes by making it permanent and inescapable. Residents suffered health problems related to disrupted circadian rhythms, with the night shift experiencing higher rates of depression, insomnia, and metabolic disorders. The split community created social fragmentation, as residents on opposite shifts might as well have lived in different vaults. The vault's operations suffered from the lack of coordination between shifts. Problems that arose during one shift wouldn't be addressed until the other shift discovered them hours later, creating delays and miscommunication that threatened vault stability. The transition periods between shifts became chaotic as tired workers tried to brief their replacements before leaving. The experiment demonstrated that human circadian rhythms resist permanent alteration, that fighting biological rhythms creates cascading health problems. The vault's split population could never form cohesive community because half of them were always absent, asleep while the others lived their lives. The experiment succeeded in creating profound isolation through temporal rather than spatial separation. Vault 33 experimented with mandatory public confession, requiring all residents to stand before the community weekly and confess their sins, crimes, shames, or secrets. The confessions were recorded and archived, with failure to confess resulting in reduced rations. Vault-Tec wanted to study how forced public shame would affect social cohesion, privacy, and individual psychology. The first confessions were mild, with residents admitting minor infractions or sharing embarrassing stories. However, as weeks passed and residents ran out of genuine confessions, they began inventing transgressions to satisfy the requirement. The line between actual guilt and performed shame blurred as people confessed to things they hadn't done, simply to have something to say. The psychological impact was devastating. Residents lived in constant fear of judgment, knowing that anything they did could become next week's confession. Some became paralyzed by guilt, unable to take any action that might require confession. Others became shameless, reasoning that since everything would be confessed anyway, there was no point in restraint. The vault's moral framework collapsed as confession became performance rather than genuine accountability. The archives of confessions became tools of social control, with residents using others' recorded shames to manipulate or blackmail them. The recordings that were supposed to create accountability instead became weapons, destroying trust and creating power hierarchies based on who had the most damaging information about whom. The vault descended into mutual surveillance and exploitation. The experiment showed that forced confession destroys the psychological benefits of voluntary accountability. When shame becomes performance rather than genuine remorse, it loses any constructive purpose. The vault's residents learned to hide their true selves while performing contrition, creating a culture of dishonesty disguised as radical honesty. Vault 28 contained an experiment in extreme inequality, where resources were distributed in exponentially decreasing amounts based on arbitrary initial assignment. The wealthiest residents received hundreds of times more than the poorest, with no ability to change positions through work or merit. Vault-Tec wanted to study how extreme inequality would affect social stability when the hierarchy was both permanent and obviously unjust. The wealthy section lived in luxury, while the poor section faced constant deprivation, creating tensions that Vault-Tec monitored for signs of revolution or resignation. The middle classes watched both extremes, uncertain whether to align with the suffering poor or aspire to the comfortable wealthy. The vault's culture became defined by its class divisions, with each level developing distinct norms and values. The poor residents initially attempted to change the system through formal channels, petitioning for redistribution or challenging the arbitrary nature of the assignments. When these efforts failed, some turned to theft or violence, while others sank into resignation. The wealthy struggled with guilt or rationalization, either donating resources to the poor or convincing themselves that the poor deserved their poverty. The experiment revealed how inequality creates not just material suffering, but moral corruption. The wealthy became either guilty or callous, the poor became either angry or defeated, and the middle classes became calculating about whose side to take. The vault's social fabric tore along economic lines that were entirely artificial but felt increasingly natural as time passed. The long-term outcome showed that extreme inequality is unstable even when backed by institutional authority. The vault eventually experienced violent uprising as the poor decided they had nothing left to lose. The rebellion didn't result in equality, but in new hierarchies, showing how difficult it is to escape patterns of inequality once they're established. Vault 63 experimented with complete silence, prohibiting all verbal communication and punishing spoken words with harsh penalties. Residents could only communicate through writing, gestures, or approved sign language, with Vault-Tec studying how language deprivation would affect cognition, social bonding, and cultural transmission. The children who grew up in silence developed differently from children raised with speech. Their cognitive development showed deficits in certain areas, while compensating through enhanced visual and spatial processing. They thought in images and signs rather than words, creating a mental landscape fundamentally different from verbal thinkers. The vault's culture became visual and gestural, losing the oral traditions that usually preserve community history. The psychological impact of enforced silence was profound. Residents reported feeling isolated even in crowds, unable to express complex thoughts that required verbal precision. Emotional expression became difficult as the nuances conveyed through tone and inflection were lost. The vault developed alternative emotional languages through body posture and facial expression, but these couldn't fully replace speech. The social bonds that typically form through conversation became difficult to establish and maintain. Residents struggled to develop deep relationships when communication required constant effort and translation. The isolation within the vault's community demonstrated how thoroughly humans depend on speech for social connection, even when alternative communication methods exist. The experiment proved that language serves functions beyond information transfer, that speech is fundamental to how humans process thought and build relationships. The Silent Vault's residents adapted, but at significant cognitive and social cost, showing that communication method shapes consciousness itself. Vault 51 contained an experiment in manufactured religious conflict, where residents were divided into groups and given contradictory religious texts that Vault-Tec created specifically to generate theological disagreements. The Vault's population was told these texts were authentic pre-war documents, with each group believing they possessed the true version, while others had corrupted copies. Vault-Tec wanted to study how religious division would affect community cohesion and whether faith could unite or destroy a population under stress. The theological disputes began as intellectual debates, but quickly escalated into identity conflicts. Each religious group developed distinct rituals, dietary restrictions, and social customs based on their texts, creating cultural divisions that went beyond simple belief differences. The Vault fragmented into competing sects who viewed each other as heretics or misguided, with each group convinced they were following the correct path. The children raised in these religious communities internalized the conflicts, learning to distrust and avoid members of other groups from early age. Interfaith friendships became rare, and marriages between groups were forbidden by community leaders seeking to maintain theological purity. The Vault's social structure ossified around religious lines, with each sect claiming different vault sections and resources. The violence erupted when one group's text predicted an apocalypse within the Vault, leading them to attempt forced conversion of others to save souls before the prophesied end. The resulting religious war devastated the Vault's population, with each side viewing their actions as divinely mandated. The conflict proved impossible to resolve through compromise, because each group's foundational texts were incompatible by design. The experiment demonstrated how easily religious belief could be weaponized, how manufactured theological differences could create genuine hatred between people who shared everything except their assigned doctrines. The Vault's residents fought and died over texts that Vault-Tec writers had created in corporate offices, their sincere faith exploited for data about sectarian conflict. Vault 84 experimented with continuous low-level pain, using the Vault's environmental systems to maintain conditions that caused persistent discomfort without causing serious injury. The temperature was kept slightly too cold, the humidity slightly too high, the air pressure slightly too low, and the lighting slightly too dim. Each individual factor was tolerable, but the combination created constant physical discomfort that residents could never escape or fully adapt to. The cumulative effect of perpetual discomfort eroded psychological resilience over time. Residents became irritable and short-tempered, their patience worn thin by bodies that never felt quite right. Sleep quality deteriorated as the uncomfortable conditions made rest difficult, creating a population that was perpetually exhausted and physically stressed. The Vault's culture developed around shared suffering, with residents bonding over their collective misery. However, this solidarity was fragile, as the constant discomfort also made people less tolerant of each other's quirks and needs. Arguments erupted over minor issues that comfortable people would have ignored, the low-level pain removing the buffer that normally prevents conflicts. The children raised in persistent discomfort showed developmental differences, their bodies adapting to the uncomfortable baseline as normal. They didn't recognize how their environment differed from optimal conditions, having no experience of physical comfort to compare against. Their health suffered in ways that only became apparent in adulthood, when chronic conditions emerged from years of environmental stress. The experiment revealed how environmental factors that individually seem minor can combine into significant quality of life degradation. The residents weren't being tortured in any obvious way, but the cumulative effect of multiple small discomforts created suffering that was difficult to articulate or address. The vault demonstrated how systems could harm people while maintaining plausible deniability about the harm being deliberate. Vault 98 contained an experiment in false history, where all historical records and educational materials were deliberately altered to present a fictional version of pre war America and world history. Vault Tech wanted to study how cultural identity would develop around manufactured past, whether societies could function normally while believing historical lies, and how long it would take for truth to emerge if it existed anywhere in the vault. The residents grew up learning history that never happened, believing in events and people that Vault Tech had invented. Their understanding of why the world ended, what led to the war, and what pre-war society was like bore no resemblance to reality. This false foundation shaped their values, their understanding of human nature, and their expectations about how societies should function. The second generation, taught the false history by parents who believed it, had even less access to truth than the first. The lies became more entrenched with each telling, details added or altered as oral tradition filled gaps in the written false records. The vault's culture developed around myths that had no connection to actual human history. The psychological impact emerged when a maintenance worker discovered actual historical records hidden in a sealed technical section. The revelation that everything they had been taught was false created existential crisis among residents who suddenly questioned every aspect of their worldview. If the history was false, what else had been lies? Could they trust anything they believed? The vault split between those who accepted the truth and those who rejected it as the real deception, preferring to believe the comfortable lies they had grown up with rather than accept that their entire understanding was manufactured. The conflict between truth and comfortable fiction destroyed the community's cohesion, proving that shared false beliefs could create functional society only until truth emerged to shatter the illusion. Vault 25 experimented with extreme overcrowding during childhood, followed by isolation in adulthood, forcing residents to transition from packed communal living to individual cells with no human contact. Vault Tech wanted to study how dramatic reversals in social conditions would affect psychology and behavior, whether adaptation to one extreme would make adaptation to its opposite easier or harder. The children grew up in packed dormitories where personal space was impossible, learning to navigate constant proximity and develop social skills for managing unavoidable closeness. They became experts at reading social cues, detecting mood changes, and negotiating shared space. Their identities formed in constant context of others, making them highly social and group-oriented. The transition to isolation cells in early adulthood was traumatic. Residents who had never known privacy suddenly found themselves alone, cut off from the social networks that had defined their existence. The silence and empty space that some people find peaceful felt like sensory deprivation to individuals conditioned for constant company. Many experienced panic attacks, depression, and desperate attempts to maintain contact through walls and ventilation systems. The experiment revealed that adaptation to one extreme doesn't prepare someone for its opposite, but instead makes the transition more difficult. The residents' childhood overcrowding had shaped their psychology in ways that made isolation unbearable, their social skills and group identity becoming liabilities in solitary confinement. The vault demonstrated how environmental conditioning creates specialized adaptations that may be maladaptive when conditions change. The long-term survivors who eventually left the vaults struggled to find appropriate social distance in wasteland communities. They alternated between seeking intense closeness that reminded them of childhood and withdrawing into isolation that recalled their adult training. Neither extreme felt natural because their development had been split between two incompatible conditions, leaving them unable to navigate normal social relationships. Vault 37 contained an experiment in false enemy creation, where the vault's systems were programmed to generate fake alerts about external threats that didn't exist. Residents received regular warnings about raiders, mutants, or other dangers supposedly trying to breach the vault, creating a siege mentality despite being perfectly safe. Vault-Tec wanted to study how constant external threat would affect internal cohesion and whether manufactured enemies would unite or divide the population. The fake threats initially brought the community together, with residents cooperating to prepare for attacks that never came. They organized watches, conducted drills, and developed defensive strategies against imaginary enemies. The shared sense of danger created strong social bonds and willingness to sacrifice personal interests for group security. However, as years passed without actual attacks, some residents began questioning whether the threats were real. Skeptics who doubted the warnings faced social ostracism from those who believed, creating division between those who maintained vigilance and those who saw it as wasted effort. The vault split between factions who couldn't agree on basic facts about their situation. The psychological toll of constant alertness without payoff created a population prone to paranoia and conspiracy thinking. When the expected attacks never materialized, some residents concluded that internal traitors must be preventing the enemy from attacking, leading to witch hunts for imaginary saboteurs. The manufactured external threat evolved into genuine internal suspicion, destroying the unity it had initially created. The experiment demonstrated that fear-based cohesion is temporary and unsustainable, that communities united only by external threats will turn on themselves when the threats fail to materialize. The vault's residents became experts at seeing enemies everywhere, a mindset that served them poorly when they eventually entered the wasteland and needed to distinguish between actual dangers and paranoid projections. Vault 49 experimented with reversed gravity in certain sections, using modified technology to create zones where down was up and up was down. Residents had to navigate between normal and inverted gravity multiple times daily, adapting their movement and spatial reasoning to environments that contradicted their physical intuitions. Vault-Tec wanted to study how extreme environmental disorientation would affect cognition and adaptation. The residents developed specialized movement techniques for transitioning between gravity zones, learning to reorient quickly and maintain equilibrium despite contradictory sensory input. However, the constant adaptation created chronic balance problems and spatial disorientation that persisted even in normal gravity. Their inner ears and proprioceptive systems struggled with environments that regularly violated physical expectations. The children raised with inverted gravity zones showed different neural development than standard humans, their brains adapting to process contradictory spatial information as normal. They became more flexible in their thinking, but also struggled with assumptions about physics that most people take for granted. Their cognitive development showed both advantages and deficits compared to children raised in consistent gravity. The psychological impact included persistent feelings of disorientation and unreality, as residents learned they couldn't trust their physical senses about basic facts like which direction was down. This undermined their confidence in perception generally, making them uncertain about information that others would accept without question. The vault created a population that doubted everything because their environment had taught them that fundamental assumptions could be wrong. The experiment proved that environmental consistency matters for cognitive development and psychological stability. The residents adapted to reversed gravity, but at significant cost to their spatial reasoning, balance, and sense of physical reality. Their flexibility came from necessity rather than advantage, showing how extreme adaptation demands still exact psychological prices. Vault 61 contained an experiment in forced talent suppression, where residents were forbidden from pursuing their natural abilities and instead assigned tasks they had no aptitude for. Musicians were made to do mathematics, mathematicians to create art, artists to conduct scientific research, with punishments for anyone who tried to work in their area of natural talent. Vault-Tec wanted to study how blocking self-expression and forcing people into unsuitable roles would affect satisfaction and productivity. The residents experienced profound frustration as they struggled with tasks they had no aptitude for, while watching others equally struggle in roles that the residents themselves could have excelled at. The vault's overall productivity suffered as everyone worked in fields they were unsuited for, creating inefficiency and poor outcomes across all areas. The community recognized that simple reassignment would solve many problems, but vault rules forbade matching people to their talents. The psychological damage manifested as depression and loss of identity. Residents who had defined themselves through their abilities found themselves unable to use the skills that made them feel competent and valuable. The forced incompetence created a sense of worthlessness and frustration, as people knew they could contribute more effectively if only they were allowed to do what they were good at. Some residents secretly pursued their talents in hidden ways, creating underground music or solving mathematical puzzles in private. These forbidden activities became acts of resistance, maintaining identity in the face of systems designed to deny it. The vault developed a shadow culture of prohibited excellence, where people's true abilities existed only in secret. The experiment demonstrated that forcing people into unsuitable roles doesn't just reduce productivity, but damages psychological health and sense of self. The vault showed how important it is for people to use their natural talents, how much of identity and satisfaction comes from competence and meaningful contribution. The residents who survived carried resentment towards systems that waste human potential through arbitrary assignment rather than thoughtful matching. Vault 73 experimented with reversed consequences, where good behavior was punished and bad behavior was rewarded. Acts of kindness resulted in reduced rations, while cruelty earned extra food and privileges. Honesty was punished, lying was rewarded, and cooperation was treated as violation, while selfish behavior was encouraged. Vault-Tec wanted to study whether consistent reversal of normal moral consequences would create a population that genuinely valued cruelty over kindness. The residents initially struggled to adapt to the reversed system, their moral intuitions in conflict with the incentive structure. Parents who wanted to teach children kindness faced the dilemma that kindness would make their children's lives harder. The vault's social structure inverted, as people who would normally be punished for antisocial behavior became the most successful and respected. However, the complete reversal of moral consequences created a population that understood kindness was actually good, but were forced to perform cruelty for survival. The residents developed double consciousness, maintaining private moral beliefs while publicly performing the cruelty that the system rewarded. This split between inner values and outer behavior created profound psychological stress. The children raised in this system faced particular confusion, taught that cruelty was good while experiencing the emotional reality that kindness felt better. Some internalized the system's values and became genuinely cruel, while others developed resistance to external moral frameworks generally, trusting their feelings over what they were told. The vault created a population with deeply conflicted moral development. The experiment revealed that moral intuitions aren't purely learned but have innate components that resist social conditioning. The residents could be forced to perform cruelty, but maintaining their understanding that kindness was actually preferable. The vault showed the limits of behavioral conditioning, how deeply ingrained human moral sense resists complete reversal even when survival depends on it. Vault 89 contained an experiment in temporal displacement training, where residents were taught that they were actually living in different time periods than they were. Some were told it was still the 1950s, other that it was the distant future, with the vault's decor and available information tailored to match each resident's assigned time period. Vault-Tech wanted to study how temporal confusion would affect behavior and whether people could function normally while believing they existed in different eras. The residents developed separate subcultures based on their temporal assignments, each group believing they were the ones living in the correct time, while others were confused or deluded. The 1950s group followed period-appropriate social norms and etiquette. The future group adopted behaviors they imagined would be common in advanced societies, and each group viewed the others with confusion or pity. The temporal confusion created practical difficulties as residents tried to use technology or follow protocols from their assigned era rather than the actual present. Maintenance became complicated when workers believed they were repairing equipment from different time periods, approaching problems with assumptions that didn't match reality. The vault's operations suffered from residents working from incompatible temporal frameworks. The psychological impact included profound disorientation and difficulty trusting perception. Residents received contradictory information about what year it was, what technology existed, and what had happened historically. This undermined their ability to form coherent understanding of reality, creating population that couldn't agree on basic facts about their current existence. The experiment demonstrated how shared understanding of time and context is necessary for functional community. The temporal displacement created communication breakdowns and coordination failures that prevented effective cooperation. The vault showed that humans need consensus about basic reality to work together, that societies fragment when members believe they exist in fundamentally different worlds. Vault 44 experimented with mandatory role-playing, where each resident was assigned a character they had to perform at all times. Personalities, beliefs, relationships, and behaviors were scripted, with residents required to stay in character or face punishment. Vault-Tech wanted to study how sustained performance of false identities would affect sense of self and whether people would eventually become the roles they played. The residents initially experienced the role-playing as absurd theater, maintaining awareness of their true selves beneath the performed characters. However, as years passed with no break from performance, the line between actor and role began to blur. People forgot which beliefs were authentically theirs, and which were their characters, which relationships were real, and which were scripted. The children raised in this environment faced particular identity confusion, learning to perform assigned roles without ever developing authentic self-expression. They grew up uncertain which thoughts and feelings were genuinely theirs, and which were character performance. The Vault created a generation that lacked stable core identity, instead maintaining multiple performed selves without any authentic center. Some residents experienced psychological breaks as the sustained performance became unbearable. They would suddenly drop character and insist on being recognized as their true selves, only to find that others had to continue treating them as their assigned role or face punishment themselves. The inability to ever be authentic created existential crises that the Vault's systems had no way to address. The experiment revealed how performance of identity eventually becomes identity itself, that sustained acting can dissolve the boundary between real and performed self. The Vault demonstrated that humans need opportunities for authenticity, that constant performance without breaks destroys psychological integrity. The residents who survived carried uncertain sense of who they really were beneath the roles they had learned to inhabit. Vault 52 contained an experiment in sensory enhancement and deprivation combinations, where different senses were artificially enhanced or suppressed in different residents. Some had enhanced hearing but reduced vision, others had heightened smell but dulled touch, creating a population where each person experienced reality through a different sensory filter. Vault Tech wanted to study how sensory diversity would affect communication and social cohesion. The residents struggled to communicate about shared experiences when they perceived those experiences so differently. A meal that tasted bland to one person might overwhelm another whose taste was enhanced, while someone with reduced taste perception might not understand what the others were experiencing. The vault's shared reality became fragmented as each person's perceptual world was unique. The sensory modifications created natural divisions as people with similar sensory profiles gravitated toward each other. Those with enhanced vision developed visual culture and communication, while those with reduced vision but enhanced hearing created sound-based social structures. The vault fragmented into sensory communities that struggled to bridge the perceptual gaps between them. The children inherited their parents' sensory modifications, creating generational communities defined by shared perceptual experience. The visual enhanced line developed differently from the sound enhanced line, each adapting their culture and technology to their specific sensory strengths. The vault's population diverged into distinct perceptual subspecies over generations. The experiment demonstrated how thoroughly sensory experience shapes culture and identity, how much of human commonality depends on shared perceptual baseline. The vault's residents couldn't fully understand each other's experiences because they literally perceived different worlds. The sensory modifications created divisions that couldn't be overcome through goodwill or communication, showing how fundamental shared perception is to community formation. Vault 93 experimented with mandatory dream sharing, using technology that recorded dreams and made them accessible to the entire vault population. Every resident's dreams were public, visible to anyone who wanted to view them, with no privacy for subconscious thoughts or desires. Vault Tech wanted to study how loss of mental privacy would affect psychology, relationships, and social dynamics. The residents initially found the dream sharing embarrassing as their private fantasies, fears, and desires became public knowledge. Dreams that revealed attraction, aggression, or anxiety became social currency, with residents judged for their subconscious content. The inability to control or hide dream content created constant vulnerability and shame. The psychological impact was severe as residents became afraid to sleep, knowing their dreams would be public. Some developed insomnia trying to avoid dreaming, while others attempted to consciously control dream content to maintain acceptable public image. The stress of public subconscious created anxiety that itself generated more embarrassing dreams, creating a cycle of shame and stress. Relationships became complicated as partners saw each other's dreams about past lovers, secret desires, or doubts about the relationship. No thought could remain private, no doubt could be worked through internally before sharing. The total transparency destroyed the mental privacy that healthy relationships need, creating conflicts based on dreams that might not reflect actual feelings or intentions. The experiment revealed how important mental privacy is for psychological health and social functioning. The residents needed space between thoughts and actions, between feelings and expressions, to maintain relationships and self-control. The forced dream sharing eliminated that space, creating population that couldn't distinguish between having thought and acting on it, where every subconscious impulse became public fact. Vault 67 contained an experiment in reversed aging, using experimental treatments that made adults younger while children grew older at accelerated rates. Parents became younger than their children, Authority figures regressed to childhood, while children were forced into adult responsibilities. Vault-Tec wanted to study how reversed age relationships would affect family structures and social hierarchies. The children thrust into premature adulthood struggled with responsibilities they weren't developmentally ready for. Their bodies aged faster than their emotional maturity, creating adults with childlike understanding, trying to manage vault operations and raise their own regressing parents. The reversed family dynamics created psychological trauma as children had to parent their parents, watching adults they had depended on become dependent on them. The adults experiencing forced regression initially tried to maintain their authority and knowledge, but as their bodies and minds became younger, they lost capabilities and memories. Former overseers became children who vaguely remembered being in charge, but lacked the cognitive capacity to understand what that had meant. The vault lost accumulated wisdom as adults regressed past the point of being able to pass on their knowledge. The social structure collapsed as age-based hierarchies became meaningless. The oldest people were physically youngest, the youngest were oldest, and no one could agree on who should have authority. The vault's operations deteriorated as experienced workers became too young to perform their jobs, while inexperienced children tried to fill roles they didn't understand. The experiment demonstrated how thoroughly age and development shape social organization, how much of hierarchy and family structure depends on predictable aging patterns. The reversed aging destroyed the foundations of social order, creating chaos that no system could contain. The vault showed that some aspects of human organization depend on biological constants that cannot be violated without catastrophic consequences. Vault 31 experimented with false resource scarcity announcements, randomly declaring different resources critically short, even when supplies were abundant. One day, water would be announced as nearly depleted, requiring strict rationing. The next day, the water crisis would be declared over, but food would be announced as running out. Vault-Tec wanted to study how constant false alarms would affect trust in authority and resource management behavior. The residents initially responded to each crisis announcement with appropriate concern and conservation. However, as crises were announced and then quietly forgotten without explanation, people began ignoring the warnings. The vault developed a culture of skepticism toward official announcements, with residents assuming that scarcity claims were false until proven otherwise. The trust breakdown extended beyond resource announcements to all official communications. When the vault leadership announced genuine problems, residents dismissed them as more false alarms. The boy who cried wolf effect meant that real crises couldn't be addressed because the population had learned to ignore warnings. The resource hoarding behavior that developed persisted even after residents recognized the announcements were false. People stockpiled supplies during announced shortages and refused to share during announced surpluses. Their behavior shaped more by the pattern of announcements than by actual conditions. The vault's economy became dysfunctional as rational response to false information created irrational outcomes. The experiment revealed how quickly false information can destroy institutional trust, how difficult it is to maintain credibility once lost. The vault's leadership found themselves unable to govern because residents no longer believed anything they said. The experiment succeeded in documenting how false crises destroy social cohesion, but failed to identify any way to rebuild trust once broken. Vault 57 contained an experiment in mandatory perspective rotation, where residents were required to regularly argue for positions they didn't hold and against positions they believed in. Every resident had to spend time defending views they opposed and attacking views they supported, with evaluations based on how convincingly they argued against their actual beliefs. Vault-Tec wanted to study how forced advocacy for opposed positions would affect personal conviction and social discourse. The residents found the mandatory perspective rotation intellectually stimulating initially, enjoying the challenge of arguing positions they disagreed with. However, as the exercise continued indefinitely, many found their actual beliefs weakening. The practice of arguing against their convictions planted doubts, while defending opposed positions made those positions seem more reasonable. The social discourse became confusing as residents couldn't tell when others were expressing genuine beliefs versus performing assigned advocacy. Relationships formed around shared positions only to dissolve when it turned out one person was only pretending to hold those views as part of rotation assignment. The vault lost the ability to maintain coherent ideological communities because belief expression was divorced from actual conviction. The psychological impact included increased uncertainty and decreased ability to maintain firm positions on anything. Residents who regularly argued both sides of every issue found themselves genuinely unsure what they believed. The perspective rotation succeeded in creating open mindedness, but at the cost of paralyzing residents with uncertainty about their own values. The experiment demonstrated that arguing positions is different from holding them, that forced advocacy can undermine genuine conviction. The vault's residents became skilled debaters but lost moral certainty, able to argue any side but unable to commit to any position. The intellectual flexibility came at the cost of stable values and clear identity. Vault 82 experimented with communal property ownership, where nothing belonged to individuals and everything was shared by everyone. Personal possessions were forbidden, with all items including clothing, tools, and even personal effects being available for anyone to use. Vault Tech wanted to study how complete elimination of private property would affect behavior, satisfaction, and social organization. The residents struggled with the lack of personal ownership, finding themselves unable to maintain any continuity in their material existence. They couldn't keep favorite items, customize spaces to their preferences, or accumulate possessions that reflected their identities. The constant circulation of all goods through the communal pool created disconnection from material objects. The tragedy of the commons emerged quickly as shared items were poorly maintained. No one felt responsible for caring for objects that would soon be used by someone else, leading to rapid deterioration of the vault's material goods. Tools broke from misuse, clothing became filthy and damaged, and spaces remained messy because cleaning benefited everyone but cost the cleaner effort. Some residents developed attachment to specific items despite the prohibition on ownership, hiding favorite possessions or marking them in subtle ways to reclaim them from the communal pool. This underground property system contradicted the vault's official rules, but emerged naturally as people sought stability in their material relationships. The vault divided between those who followed the communal property rules and those who created hidden private property. The experiment revealed that humans need some level of property ownership to develop identity and feel invested in maintaining their environment. The complete elimination of private property created apathy and disconnection, showing that ownership serves psychological functions beyond simple resource control. The vault demonstrated that the commons requires some level of private stakes to prevent deterioration. Vault 29 experimented with manufactured memory implantation, using technology to give residents false memories of events that never happened. The memories ranged from minor alterations to complete fabrications, with some residents remembering childhoods they never had or relationships with people who didn't exist. Vault Tech wanted to study how false memories would affect identity, decision-making, and social relationships when people's pasts were partially or completely fictional. The residents initially had no way to distinguish between real and implanted memories, both feeling equally authentic. They built their identities around experiences that had never occurred, making choices based on lessons learned from events that were fabricated. The vault's population developed into people whose entire understanding of who they were rested on foundations that were partially or completely false. The social fabric became unstable as people's memories of shared experiences didn't match. Family members remembered different versions of the same events, or one person remembered an event that others insisted never occurred. These conflicting memories created constant disputes and eroded trust, as residents couldn't agree on basic facts about their collective history. The psychological crisis emerged when some residents discovered evidence that their memories had been manipulated. The realization that their pasts might be fabricated destroyed their sense of identity and made them question everything they believed about themselves. If their memories couldn't be trusted, who were they really? The vault created a population that couldn't trust their own minds, living with constant uncertainty about which parts of their experience were real. The experiment revealed how thoroughly identity depends on memory, how much of self-concept derives from personal history. The residents whose memories were manipulated lost the stable foundation that memory provides, becoming uncertain about their own nature and incapable of making confident decisions. The vault showed that even false memories serve identity functions if believed, but that discovering the falseness destroys both the memories and the self built upon them. Vault 41 contained an experiment in forced creativity, where residents were required to produce art, music, or writing daily regardless of talent or inspiration. Output was evaluated and ranked publicly, with the least creative residents facing reduced privileges. Vault-Tec wanted to study how mandatory creativity under pressure would affect artistic output and whether forcing creative production would enhance or destroy genuine artistic impulse. The residents initially approached the mandatory creativity as challenge, attempting to meet the requirements through whatever skills they possessed. However, the pressure to produce daily transformed creative expression from pleasure into burden. Artists who might have created for joy found themselves producing mechanically to meet quotas, their work becoming soulless repetition rather than genuine expression. The public ranking system created competition and comparison that poisoned the creative process. Residents focused on producing work that would rank highly rather than work that expressed their authentic vision. The vault's culture became obsessed with creative status, with residents' worth measured by their daily ranking rather than their contributions to community or relationships. The psychological toll manifested as creative burnout and resentment toward artistic expression itself. Many residents came to hate the creative process, associating it with pressure and judgment rather than fulfillment. The few naturally talented individuals felt exploited, their gifts turned into performance obligations rather than personal joy. The experiment demonstrated that creativity requires freedom and internal motivation, that forcing creative output destroys the very qualities that make art valuable. The vault's mandatory creativity produced vast quantities of technically competent but emotionally empty work, showing that art requires more than skill and effort to be meaningful. The residents learned to produce without creating, to perform creativity without experiencing it. Vault 32 experimented with reversed day-night cycles that changed randomly with no predictable pattern for when lights would be on or off. Residents never knew when day would end or how long night would last, creating temporal chaos that prevented circadian rhythm establishment. Vault-Tec wanted to study how complete temporal unpredictability would affect health, productivity, and social coordination. The residents struggled to coordinate activities when no one could predict when the next light period would begin or end. Work schedules became impossible to maintain. Social gatherings were constantly interrupted by unexpected darkness, and sleep became random rather than cyclical. The vault descended into temporal chaos where planning became futile and routine impossible. The health consequences were severe, as bodies tried to maintain circadian rhythms without any external cues. Residents experienced constant jet lag, their internal clocks fighting environmental signals that changed without pattern. Sleep quality deteriorated as people never knew when they would next have opportunity to rest, leading to chronic exhaustion and cognitive impairment. The social structure collapsed as coordination became impossible. Meetings couldn't be scheduled, shared meals couldn't be arranged, and community activities fell apart when participants couldn't agree on when to gather. The vault's population fragmented into individuals living on personal schedules that had no connection to anyone else's timing. The experiment proved that humans need temporal predictability to function, that random time cycles destroy both individual health and social cohesion. The vault's residents adapted by abandoning attempts at scheduling and instead living in perpetual readiness for whatever the lighting system would do next. This constant vigilance created stress and prevented the psychological rest that comes from predictable routine. Vault 62 contained an experiment in mandatory positivity, where residents were forbidden from expressing negative emotions or acknowledging problems. All communication had to be cheerful and optimistic, regardless of circumstances, with those who expressed sadness, anger, or concern facing punishment. Vault-Tec wanted to study how forced emotional suppression would affect mental health and whether mandatory positivity would improve or destroy community morale. The residents initially attempted to comply with the positivity requirements, masking their genuine feelings with forced cheerfulness. However, the inability to acknowledge or process negative emotions created psychological pressure that had no outlet. Problems went unaddressed because admitting they existed violated the positivity mandate, allowing issues to fester and grow worse. The emotional suppression created a culture of toxic positivity where genuine feelings were forbidden. Residents experiencing grief, fear, or frustration had to hide those emotions, creating isolation as everyone pretended to be fine while suffering privately. The lack of authentic emotional expression prevented the formation of genuine connections, as relationships require honesty about both positive and negative feelings. The children raised in mandatory positivity developed emotional regulation problems, never learning to identify or process negative emotions because expressing them was forbidden. They grew into adults who couldn't handle adversity because they had never been allowed to acknowledge that difficulties existed. The vault created a generation emotionally crippled by the requirement to pretend everything was always wonderful. The experiment revealed that negative emotions serve important functions, that suppressing them doesn't eliminate problems but prevents addressing them. The vault's mandatory positivity created a population that appeared happy but was deeply dysfunctional, unable to solve problems because they couldn't admit problems existed. The residents learned that forced happiness is indistinguishable from denial and equally destructive to well-being. Vault 54 experimented with language fragmentation, deliberately introducing new vocabulary and grammar rules that changed monthly. Residents had to constantly learn and adapt to evolving language rules, with communication becoming increasingly difficult as the language drifted further from its original form. Vault-Tec wanted to study how linguistic instability would affect culture, knowledge transmission, and social cohesion. The monthly language changes created communication barriers between residents who learned the updates at different rates. Older residents struggled to keep pace with new vocabulary, while younger residents adopted changes quickly, creating generational linguistic divides. The vault's population fragmented into age groups who couldn't fully understand each other's speech. The knowledge transmission problems became severe as technical manuals and historical records became incomprehensible once the language had changed enough. The vault lost access to its own documentation, with residents unable to read materials written just years earlier. accumulated knowledge became inaccessible as the linguistic drift created barriers to understanding the past. The cultural impact was profound as oral traditions and stories became distorted through translation across multiple language iterations. The vault's history and values were lost or transformed as each retelling required adaptation to new linguistic frameworks. The community's identity eroded as shared cultural memory became impossible to maintain across the linguistic changes. The experiment demonstrated how thoroughly language shapes culture and enables social continuity. The vault's linguistic fragmentation destroyed knowledge preservation, generational connection, and cultural identity. The residents created new culture around their changing language, but lost connection to their origins, showing how language stability matters for maintaining social memory across time. Vault 78 contained an experiment in partial sensory replacement, where vision was replaced with echolocation, hearing with vibration sensing, or other combinations of substituted senses. Residents experienced reality through radically different perceptual mechanisms than normal humans, with Vault-Tec studying how sensory substitution would affect cognition, behavior, and social organization. The residents adapted to their substitute senses with varying success, developing new ways of processing information that felt alien compared to normal human perception. Those using echolocation instead of vision learned to navigate by sound, but lost the visual beauty and color that sighted people experience. Those sensing vibration instead of sound missed the richness of music and speech while gaining sensitivity to physical phenomena that others couldn't detect. The perceptual differences created communication challenges as residents couldn't share certain types of experiences. Describing a sunset meant nothing to someone who had never seen color, while explaining the texture of vibration patterns was impossible for those who only heard sound. The vault's population shared physical space, but inhabited different perceptual worlds. The psychological impact included sense of loss for replaced perceptions and frustration at the limitations of substitute senses. Residents mourned the sensory experiences they no longer had access to while struggling to appreciate the new perceptual capabilities they had gained. The forced trade-offs created resentment rather than gratitude, as people focused on what they lost rather than what they gained. The experiment revealed that while sensory substitution is possible, it comes with significant costs to quality of life and social connection. The residents adapted to their new perceptual frameworks, but never fully accepted them, always aware they were experiencing diminished versions of normal human sensation. The vault showed that some aspects of human experience depend on specific sensory modalities and cannot be fully replaced by alternatives. Vault 94 experimented with memory rotation, where residents' memories were periodically redistributed among the population. People would wake with someone else's memories, in addition to or replacing their own, creating a population whose personal histories were scrambled across multiple individuals. Vault-Tec wanted to study how identity would survive when memories could no longer be counted on to remain with their original owners. The memory rotation created identity crises as residents found themselves with experiences they didn't recognize and emotions connected to events they couldn't remember living through. Some woke with memories of families they had never had. Others lost their own childhood memories while gaining someone else's. The vault's population struggled to maintain stable identities when their pasts were constantly shifting. The social relationships became complicated as people's memories of each other didn't match. Someone might remember a close friendship that the other person had no recollection of, or harbor resentment for wrongs that they hadn't personally experienced, but now remembered as if they had. The vault's social fabric tore as shared history became impossible to maintain. The few residents who managed to keep some of their original memories became treasured sources of continuity, their stable pasts serving as anchors in the sea of shifting recollections. However, even these individuals couldn't be certain which memories were originally theirs and which had been added during rotations, undermining their ability to serve as reliable historians. The experiment demonstrated that identity depends on memory continuity, that self requires stable personal history to exist coherently. The vault's memory rotation destroyed the residents' ability to know who they were, creating a population that existed in perpetual identity crisis. The residents learned that without reliable memories, personality itself becomes unstable and meaningless. The accumulated weight of all vault experiments created a legacy that shaped the wasteland in ways Vault Tech never intended or anticipated. Each vault's survivors carried forward the psychological patterns, social structures, and cultural values that their experiments had created, spreading trauma and adaptation across the recovering world. The experiments didn't just study human nature, but actively transformed it, creating new types of humans shaped by their vault experiences. The Wasteland's factions and communities all bear marks of vault influence, their ideologies and practices reflecting both resistance to and internalization of the experiments they survived. The new California Republic's democratic values emerged partially from rejecting Vault 15's authoritarian structure, while the Brotherhood of Steel's technological focus reflects Vault Dwellers' complex relationship with the technology that both saved and tormented them. The individual survivors, scattered across the wasteland, carry vault conditioning that shapes their behavior in ways they often don't recognize. Trust issues, authority resistance, resource hoarding, and social difficulties can all be traced back to specific vault experiments that trained those behaviors into the residents. The experiment's psychological impact persists across generations as survivors pass their trauma and adaptations to children who never lived in vaults themselves. The physical vaults continue to influence wasteland geography and politics, their locations becoming strategic assets or cursed zones depending on their histories. Communities form around accessible vaults, conflicts erupt over vault control, and explorers risk their lives searching for sealed facilities that might contain valuable technology or knowledge. The vaults remain active elements in wasteland society long after their experimental purposes ended. The ethical questions raised by the vault experiments continue to resonate in wasteland philosophy and governance. How should communities balance collective good against individual rights? What level of suffering can be justified for knowledge or survival? When does authority become tyranny? These questions that Vault Tech forced Vault Dwellers to confront now shape how the wasteland thinks about power, consent, and human dignity. The documentation of Vault experiments serves multiple purposes in wasteland society. For some, the records are historical evidence of corporate crimes that must be preserved, so the guilty are never forgotten, even if they escaped punishment. For others, the documentation provides warnings about how easily systems can be corrupted and how thoroughly institutions can fail their stated purposes. The vault records become both memorial and cautionary tale. The survivors' testimonies, where they exist, provide human perspective on what the clinical documentation cannot capture. The logs and journals left behind in vaults transform abstract experimental designs into personal stories of suffering, resistance, and adaptation. These voices from the past remind the wasteland that statistics and data points were actually people with lives, loves, and losses that mattered beyond their utility to Vault Tech's research goals. The question of whether any vault experiment produced the knowledge worth the human cost remains controversial and ultimately unanswerable. Even if the experiments revealed genuine insights about human nature, psychology, or social organization, the lack of consent and the deliberate infliction of suffering taint whatever understanding was gained. The wasteland generally concludes that no knowledge justifies the means Vault Tech employed, that the experiments were crimes regardless of their scientific value. The few Vault-Tec employees who survived the war and left records provide conflicting perspectives on the experiments. Some expressed genuine belief that their work served important purposes, that understanding human behavior under extreme stress could help future generations survive similar challenges. Others revealed doubt and guilt, acknowledging that they participated in evil while finding ways to rationalize their involvement. None of the surviving documentation suggests any employee successfully stopped an experiment once it began. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed drifting through these quiet moments, there's another video waiting on the left of your screen. Let it play while you rest. You might discover something gentle before sleep takes you again.